Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Let's jump right into it. July 16, 2001 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. ECW joins the invasion. More by Dave Meltzer. One of the most amazing weeks in pro wrestling history saw the World Wrestling Federation abandon nearly all its plans and recreate Extreme Championship Wrestling from the ashes in a story that, truth be told, in hindsight looks like the single greatest case of manipulation in the modern history of pro wrestling. The formation of ECW was decided upon, although there were moves and hints to do so for some time, late last week after the realization that the current plans as they were laid out were going to be a disaster due to the reaction to the so-called WCW matches at last week's television tapings in Tacoma. The basic plan, much of which has been outlined here for weeks, was for WCW to get a few weeks of television exposure building a feud with WWF for a series of interpromotional matches at the July 22nd Invasion pay-per-view in Cleveland. It would be a one-time deal and the feud would end with the pay-per-view. An angle had already been set up for the next night's divorce hearing between Vince and Linda where they would split the assets down the middle. In the split, the supposed WWF would be split into two equal groups. The plan was to call one group WCW, which would run television on Mondays, start touring regularly in October as well as run its first pay-per-view show in October. The other group, WWF, would run live SmackDown on Thursdays and continue with monthly pay-per-view events. The way the storyline was written, on the July 23rd Raw show, which would include the divorce hearing, it would be announced talent would be split down the middle and all WWF and so-called WCW talent would be put in a draft. The July 30th Raw show would largely be the draft itself, patterned after the TV presentations of the NFL and NBA draft. Shane's team, called WCW, but really being mainly WWF talent, would then start on Raw on August 6th. From mid-August through early October, the schedule would increase to 5 days per week, running tours starting Thursday and ending Monday. The WWF crew would run Thursday. Friday through Sunday would be a combination crew running house shows until WCW ran its own shows in October, and the WCW crew would do Monday. The idea is this would extend the shelf life of the individual characters and slow down storylines by only having each character on one primetime show per week. But the WCW invasion, starting at the King of the Ring pay-per-view, was totally botched. One can only ask how a concept that on paper should have been the biggest money angle in history could be screwed up so badly and given up on so quickly. But that was the result of a crowd that seemed to reject it in Tacoma, and continued to do so at house show all weekend. Judging by the numbers, the Raw ratings since the invasion increased by about a half point for 3 straight weeks, showing the increase was no fluke. The house shows involving WCW talent did not do well, but those shows weren't doing well to begin with since most wrestling tickets nowadays are sold when tickets are first put on sale, long before anyone knew who would or wouldn't be appearing, and long before the WWF roster was racked with injuries, so that can't be used as an excuse either. The Invasion pay-per-view was not sold out at press time, less than 2 weeks away. The advance was strong enough that it likely would be close to full for the show, and it was not an embarrassing advance by any means. But it was hardly the overwhelming response the first interpromotional show should have had. The sad part of the WCW invasion is that it fell victim to nearly every trap that should have been avoided. One can only question how such a simple concept could be ravaged and destroyed. The WWF's stubbornness when it came to the lack of star power on the roster was explained by wanting to maintain a salary structure. Given the precarious state of the industry, those conservative values to salaries may very well have been prudent, particularly because the entire angle was to wrap up in just one pay-per-view and the WCW was going to have little to do with what once was WCW. The WCW touring group would largely be composed of WWF talent, and the main stars would have been mainline WWF talent such as Kurt Angle, perhaps Kane, Mick Foley as commissioner, and even Triple H when he returned was the plan at one point. The two groups would be kept apart, and when the time was right, perhaps a year down the road, they would do the full-fledged interpromotional angle with legs, being able to do all fresh matchups. What caught everyone by surprise was the degree of the negative reaction to the WCW brand. The feeling is Shane McMahon, as the babyface member of the family, combined with Booker T as champion immediately being programmed against WWF heels Steve Austin and Angle, would babyface an aspect of the group. DDP against Undertaker would heel an aspect. It's only one pay-per-view anyway. The reaction to WCW versus WCW was utter disdain from the audience, perhaps worse on SmackDown Live, The sound was remixed to come across better on television, because the excuse that the guys were having bad matches like Booker had with Buff Bagwell was out the window, as the fans hated two of the best matches on the show. Gregory Helms vs. Billy Kidman with a title change, and Booker vs. DDP. WWF fans have been trained to hate WCW for years from the heat of the promotional war. WCW fans, with the exception of the half point that came back to the table the past 3 weeks, that had continued to watch the second opposed hour to the bitter end, did so largely because they were simply never going to like WWF, and most weren't starting now, as the wrestling audience dwindled greatly since the folding. They were an older audience that for the most part didn't attend house shows, and certainly wouldn't attend WWF house shows nor support a WCW group without the top WCW stars from the past, or headed by a McMahon. Numerous ideas to change the angle were talked about. One thing was clear: the negative stigma of the WCW name was such that, had they gone to a name change for Raw, it would have, at least at first, been a disaster. October gave them more time, because a good product eventually would overcome the hatred for the brand name, but it would have still been a fight against the clock to keep the schedule and angle as planned. The obvious answer, as mentioned last week, was to make WCW pure heels and go with the flow, and like NWO after quick tries that failed miserably, dropped the idea for quite a while of a pure WCW show or pure WCW house shows. The fans who hate WCW would support WWF in the feud, although in that case, Shane's involvement watered down the issue. To show how wild the ideas became, there was serious talk of bringing in Eric Bischoff. Backstage at Raw in Atlanta, the talk was that Bischoff would debut the next night at SmackDown, although those in the inner circle claimed the Bischoff deal had fallen through several days earlier. The claim was that, once again, as the entire WWF versus WCW issue was booked more for ego and to prove the new group was second-rate even though they owned it, before rebuilding it. They only wanted Bischoff for 2 weeks, just long enough to save a pay-per-view they were afraid was heading for a fall. Bischoff would come in, shoot an angle, do a match with Vince, which was thought would draw a big buy rate. Vince would go over and Bischoff would never be heard from again. One WWF source claimed Bischoff turned down the idea because it was short-term, although Bischoff himself denied any approach was made, saying he couldn't believe they'd make the approach because they would have to know he'd turn it down. The answer to the dilemma to save the pay-per-view was ECW, the angle to put the group back together, link it with WCW and combine forces with the idea that Stephanie McMahon had purchased ECW and the two children were planning on running the father out of business was an amazing concession to ego. Clearly WCW being tanked was no accident. Heyman keeps his dream alive, and perhaps the WWF helps him out of at least some debts by buying whatever assets they want from his company, and the fact Heyman owed them $500,000. Head writer Stephanie is back on the air in a power position. She likely would have joined Triple H in WCW anyway had Triple H not been injured. With her in the role as head writer, ECW is also protected in a manner WCW wasn't, even during the infancy of the angle when it needed to be. In comparing ECW with WCW, the bottom line is the ECW audience is younger, smaller, particularly when it comes to television, and likely wouldn't expand the WWF's audience as much as WCW's, at least when it comes to television at first. But with Heyman doing the interviews, and making sure the angles now make sense, it has far more legs, because the WCW thing was going to go kaput right after the pay-per-view, which it was planned to do anyway, as soon as the new TV audience realized the stars they were waiting for to show up weren't coming. The lure of WCW was the star power of its aging and not-so-aging performers, which would have had fresh matchups in a new setting, although likely wouldn't have been able to deliver good matches. ECW was a concept and a cult, where the stars themselves were not as important as the loyalty to the name. ECW fans, for the most part, do attend WWF shows, as noted by the chants in most cities when former ECW performers would appear. Those from the outside putting so much emphasis on ECW by saying all they were was 0.8 ratings points and 700 to 1,500 fans in a city, most of whom in both group the WWF already has, miss the big picture. The lack of certain key ECW cult figures like Sandman means nothing. A good interpromotional angle, NWO versus WCW being the obvious comparison, swells the audience. NWO, as a name, came in with 0 fans at the start, but created a new audience for pro wrestling. Interpromotional done intriguing, always works short-term. And as TV Monday and Tuesday showed, this was done intriguing and was anything but botched. A few things seem evident. Much of the original 24 wrestlers from WCW whose contracts were purchased by WWF look to be out of luck. Most haven't even been used on television. If plans change from splitting the company into 2, This change will cost probably 24 wrestler jobs in an industry where the number of well-paying full-time jobs in this country looks to be at its lowest point since World War II. Most, the talented young cruiserweights who were the highlight of WCW shows in its last several months of existence, will likely never even have the chance to show their wares. The July 9th Raw from Atlanta was, if nothing else, eventful. It was very reminiscent actually of a Vince Russo show. A first Russo show, which usually was his best one. Remember the night Russo and Eric Bischoff came back and the fans gave the show a standing ovation at the finish after they stripped every one of their belts. Of course, few if any future shows matched up to show one. All the swerves killed anyone caring about any character and destroyed the foundation of the product. The last 30 minutes of the show had 18 months worth of angle development. First, Team ECW was formed, headed by Heyman and consisting of former ECW wrestlers Taz, Raven, Mike Awesome, Lance Storm, the Dudleys, Rob Van Dam, Tommy Dreamer, and Just Incredible, and laying out Kane and Chris Jericho. They will likely use Tajiri in some form of angle, questioning where he's going. For whatever reason, Jerry Lynn is not involved, although with nothing else on his plate and actually a good storyline about being misused for the taking, it doesn't seem to serve a purpose for him not to be. Vince and Shane, representing WWF and WCW, who haven't even started their feud, already did the bury the hatchet for a common goal angle, which usually happens with hated enemies about a year into their run, when no more money can be squeezed out of the program. But alas, just like the swerve at the beginning of the show where Shane and DDP never wrestled, and instead turned on Undertaker, basically rendering the SmackDown final angle of WCW turning on itself useless, the show ended with another swerve when the WCW and WWF teammates in the match fought among themselves. After WWF cleaned house on WCW, ECW, with a numbers advantage, attacked WWF. WCW then swerved, helping ECW, and ending with Shane and Stephanie together against Vince. The best part was when Team ECW was formed and Heyman hit the ring. He hit the promo perfect, only the second promo that touched a nerve on a serious angle in recent weeks on WWF TV. The other being the Bradshaw promo backstage rallying the WWFC team on a Raw a few weeks back, in a program that should be filled with promos of that style. It was exactly the gang beatdown and promo lacking, strangely, from the all-important first impression of the WCW invasion. The downside of this angle is that Vince versus Shane and Stephanie, with Shane and Stephanie's turn on each other inevitable, has been done in some form, with every face and heel turn imaginable, for a few years now. The positive is that Heyman, on SmackDown, delivered a promo saying that since Vince stole his concepts, his wrestlers and his TV station which put him out of business, he was going to steal Vince's children. This actually made sense out of the family stealing the angle, which for business should have, at least at first, consisted of the family banding together against a Heyman-led ECW and a WCW led by an authentic spokesperson, whether it be Bischoff or better yet, Ric Flair. Vince McMahon was surprised, because in the meeting before the show laying things out, where McMahon also wanted to make sure the big stars, Austin, Angle, and Undertaker, were nowhere near the angle where they'd get laid out, expected ECW to come across as strong heels. The crowd reaction was actually very positive toward ECW, but the next night in Birmingham the crowd was totally pro-WWF, anti-WCW, and totally confused how to react to ECW because they wanted to cheer them but were conditioned to boo them. It's noted that WWF members laid out were almost the Sunday Night Heat squad of the APA, Bob Holly, Billy Gunn, and Big Show. If nothing else, with Booker and Page also kept out of the mix, the lack of depth of the WCW group was downright scary, since the five consisted of Sean Stasiak, Chris Kanyon, Sean O'Hare, Mark Jindrak, and Chuck Palumbo, all of whom have two things in common: they are tall and they aren't considered stars. With the exception of Kanyon, all would be better off in OVW for 1 year, and at that point, at least Palumbo and O'Hare could likely walk in and be somebody's, but that may not be as easy if they're exposed too fast now. Kanyon is the only member of the group who isn't green, and while really entertaining at one point in his positively Kanyon role and a good worker, he disappeared from WCW TV for so long and was given no special intro that he just seemed like a tall nobody. This segment brought home just how lacking WCW really was in star power. At least most of Team ECW has had months, if not years, of WWF TV exposure, and it can be argued that most were heavily underutilized. Where it goes from here, it doesn't appear that anyone is sure. Booking is being done day to day. Of all the major changes in the plans, we're told that none are definites. The one most likely not to be changed is SmackDown going live on Thursdays starting August 16th. Everything else, the split crews, the draft, the evening of the sides, the separate TV shows, separate PPVs and arena tours are all up in the air. Since the angle with Linda McMahon and the splitting the assets on July 23rd was completely dropped, that would lead to believe that at least the original timetable on everything has been delayed, and likely won't be happening anytime soon. The Invasion pay-per-view has been restructured. The lineup now is DDP and Booker and Dudley's and Rhino, most likely, that could be slightly modified, versus Kane and Undertaker and Angle and Austin and Jericho, APA versus Palumbo and O'Haire in a battle of tag team champions, Kidman versus X-Pac in a battle of lighter weight champions, Stacy Keibler and Tori Wilson versus Lita and Trish Stratus in a bra and panties match, likely Edge and Christian versus Mike Awesome and Lance Storm, Nick Patrick versus Earl Hebner in a referees match, and Yoshihiro Tajiri versus Taz. Just want to say thanks to everyone that helped make the Wrestling Observer Live show so much fun for the past 21 months. As most of you know, Eyada folded on July 9th, and we were the final show closing down the station. The folding was really an inevitability, as the stories of .com businesses closing are almost a daily part of the news. The internet is a wonderful technological advancement, but so many companies went in headlong, putting much money in without the ability to make money at the other end. Conceptually, Eyada was likely ahead of its time, which was the idea to start with. The belief was that internet radio would be the future, and we were getting in on the ground floor and would theoretically be established when the popularity mushroomed. It didn't have the geographical limitations of conventional radio, nor was it regulated. When we started in October 1999, it went on the premise that right about now, all new cars would have capability to pick up the station, that you'd be able to buy a device at a nominal charge that would enable you to listen to it on your home radios and on your Walkmans. Now nearly 2 years later, that day is nowhere in sight, and without that kind of audience potential, there wasn't anywhere near the advertising income that could sustain such an operation. The problems with listening to the shows when it came to sound quality, logging on, getting knocked, servers getting overloaded made it such that you really had to want to go out of your way to listen. Still, we built a large and loyal audience, and were oftentimes the highest-rated internet-generated talk show in the country, which admittedly meant little in the grand scheme of things. I particularly want to thank Bob Merowitz for giving me and Pro Wrestling the chance to do a 2-hour daily show, especially with no prior broadcast experience. Of course, I want to thank producer Al Gachello for all his work in keeping things running, and Brian Alvarez for both his amazing insight and wit in making the 2 hours such a highlight of every day. It's a very sad and empty feeling at 1:45 p.m. thinking there is so much to talk about and people to listen to and learn from, and it's not there. I want to thank so many of the readers of this publication, which were the backbone of the audience from day one. I was very skeptical from the start, both because I thought daily was too often, 2 hours was too long, and we were starting in a media form that was almost non-existent. As it turned out, 2 hours was never too long, sometimes too short, and the show always seemed to end too soon. Unfortunately, I was correct on the third point. It would be great to keep the team together and listeners together forever, but such is not the broadcast business. And for both better and worse, we were part of the pro wrestling world. For better, we covered a subject matter that a lot of people were interested in. Eyada hired many people with bigger names, coming from major newspapers with umpteen times the circulation of this, covering people, celebrity gossip, and mainstream sports that should be far more famous. Literally, another show could get Michael Jordan on as a guest, and this happened, and we'd beat its numbers by a mile, with or without a guest. I'd like to thank so many people for their compliments on the quality of the show, but without the interesting subject matter that pro wrestling is, there would be no show, and without the other key members of the team, the show wouldn't have been anywhere close to what it was. However, because it is pro wrestling, the show is far less likely to be able to springboard from internet radio to broadcast radio as other shows with less popularity on the station will be able to do. No matter what the numbers and the audience response would say, most sports stations don't want a pro wrestling show because it's not a sport, and most other stations are even less interested. It's too bad because, like with the National, the daily newspaper that I was part of for its 16-month run, we answered the question affirmatively whether regular pro wrestling coverage would work in daily newspapers. This was at a time when there was maybe one such column in the country in a newspaper of any significance. Still, when it was over, my subject matter, even though a proven success, was categorized as a joke. In obits of the paper, the idea that they broke ground and did regular pro wrestling coverage was often considered something to laugh about. We will continue to appear every Saturday and Sunday on live audio wrestling out of Toronto, and perhaps there is a chance for a revival down the line. We have some potential options and are sorting through hoping one of them can be viable. If not, for those who were regular listeners, you are the reason the show survived this long and why all of us involved with the show looked forward to it every day. And for many listeners who are now subscribing for the first time, I hope the Written Observer lives up to your expectations and we can provide even more info than ever before, perhaps not as timely, but hopefully more detailed. For the past few weeks, it's been very much like the end of ECW, in that something big was going to happen, or it was going to die. ECW needed a television deal that would work to survive. There were negotiations going on, perhaps even coming close. But it didn't happen. There were serious negotiations to take over Winstar, a broadcast radio network, and use the Eyada programming as the staple of the network. Even as things on the surface looked bleakest, there was a good chance, with national coverage, the show would be bigger than ever, and hopefully a huge success from a stability and economic standpoint. Ultimately, after several weeks of negotiations, the deal fell through, and there was only one business decision left. The 11th annual G1 Climax tournament, which is often the in-ring highlight of the year in New Japan Pro Wrestling, had its lineup announced for shows from August 4th to August 12th in various buildings, with the final 3 nights at Tokyo Sumo Hall. It'll be the round-robin format. There is a different twist this year in that the top 2 finishers of the 6 in each block will advance to the semifinals, which take place on August 11th, Tokyo Sumo Hall. Block A will have Tatsumi Fujinami, Yuji Nagata, Manabu Nakanishi, Takashi Iizuka, Tadao Yasuda, and Kazunari Murakami. Block B has Keiji Muto, Masahiro Chono, Hiroyoshi Tenzan, Satoshi Kojima, Osamu Nishimura, and Jushin Liger. The lineup as far as names in the tournament is kind of boring overall, but the matches individually on paper look like some strong house shows. There may be a lineup change since Iizuka suffered a serious head injury when he dropped his head just as Mitsuya Nagai was aiming a kick at his upper chest and was knocked silly on the June 6th pay-per-view in what, as it turns out, was not the planned finish. Iizuka losing screwed up the best of 5 All Japan vs. New Japan series because All Japan won the first 3 matches in a row. Iizuka hasn't wrestled since and is questionable if he'll be ready. There is talk of Riki Choshu, Shiro Koshinaka or Yutaka Yoshi as a replacement. Choshu, simply because of his name value, would spice up the tournament and this is an interesting way to get him back in. Choshu, in 1996, was the star, winning the G1 tournament when before the tournament he, who had never won it before, announced it would be his final G1. The first place finisher in Block A will face the second place finisher in Block B, and the second place finisher in A will face the winner of B in matches on August 11th. The 2 winners would then advance to the championship match on August 12th in the same building. G1 has been traditionally since its inception in 1991, kind of the time of the year New Japan promotes directly to the hardcore fan as they just concentrate on elevating new people booking upset wins and usually there is so much emphasis on match quality that matches that on paper don't look good often wind up being good. The big plan for this year was for Toshiaki Kawada to appear in the A block. Murakami ended up as his replacement. It fell through because Kawada's knee is in bad shape and while he's working every night and is having great singles matches when called upon, the feeling that he would have to have 5 great singles matches in a week would be too risky. Tournament matches are August 4th at Osaka Furitsu Gym, A. Nagata vs. Murakami, Fujinami vs. Nakanishi, Iizuka vs. Yasuda, B. Chono vs. Kojima, Muto vs. Nishimura, Liger vs. Tenzan. August 5th at Osaka Furitsu Gym, A. Nakanishi vs. Nagata, Iizuka vs. Murakami, Fujinami vs. Yasuda, B. Chono vs. Tenzan, Muto vs. Liger, Nishimura vs. Kojima. August 6th at Nagoya Aichi Gym, A. Iizuka vs. Nagata, Fujinami vs. Murakami, Nakanishi vs. Yasuda, B. Muto vs. Kojima, Liger vs. Chono, Nishimura vs. Tenzan. August 8th at Sendai Miyagi Sports Center, A. Nakanishi vs. Murakami, Fujinami vs. Iizuka, Nagata vs. Yasuda, B. Muto vs. Tenzan, Nishimura vs. Chono, Liger vs. Kojima. August 10th at Tokyo Sumo Hall, A. Fujinami vs. Nagata, Nakanishi vs. Iizuka, Yasuda vs. Murakami, B. Muto vs. Chono, Tenzan vs. Kojima, Liger vs. Nishimura. From a short-term standpoint, it appears the move to rehire Jerry Lawler as WWF announcer is next to dead because of how everything went down over the past 2 weeks. It is widely believed that Lawler is likely to wind up as an announcer should the much-talked-about Hulk Hogan Federation get off the ground since Jimmy Hart would likely wind up as Hogan's key assistant. Lawler was telling people at indie bookings over the weekend that was going to be his destination. Keep in mind, in as quick changing a world as pro wrestling, next to dead one day be mean nothing by the end of the week. Lawler did a long detailed post detailing from his standpoint how everything went down in the negotiations. He did admit the call was made to bring him back for Tacoma, believed to have been made by Kevin Dunn, more than a week earlier after days later having denied talking to anyone about it. He noted that his wife's contract was different from almost anyone's in Titan and that she didn't have a downside guarantee and was only paid when she was brought into work. His point was that if they were to sign her to her same contract and not use her, it wouldn't cost the company money. Lawler said that since the firing he has learned that the reasons for the firing were unjust and untrue. He also said the person responsible no longer works for WWF and also made it clear that it wasn't China and apologized to China because there had been hints made that China in some form may have been responsible. Later in the week, Lawler did a radio interview claiming Terry Golden was that person. Those in WWF are adamant that everything went down pretty much how it was explained at the beginning, and neither China nor Golden have anything to do with this situation. The first intermediary, whose name was never mentioned, believed to be Dunn, talked with Vince and they verbally agreed to the angle and said Jim Ross would get back to him with the details. Later in the week, Lawler got called by both Ross and Dunn. This would have been Thursday. This is where Lawler was actually given the angle that he would be a WCW announcer starting with Tacoma. Lawler asked about the contract deal and Dunn told him that he assumed the two would be under the same deal. Lawler at this point asked Ross if Carter could get a minimum downside, but claimed he also said she would come back under the old deal. This is the WWF side of Lawler changing the deal after agreeing. At one point there was even a compromise suggested by Lawler where he would go in for a $52,000 per year pay cut and in exchange, Carter would get a $52,000 per week downside guarantee, so the expense to the company would be the same but Carter would have a contract. WWF turned that proposal down. Dunn said he would check with Vince. Then Dunn called the next day, which would have been June 29th, and said he met with Vince again and Vince wanted to make clear there were no plans for Carter after appearances on Raw and SmackDown in Tacoma. Dunn told Lawler that he felt that with him working for the company, that the writers would likely come up with something for her, so he agreed to the terms. He said Ross also agreed to use Carter for on sales. Then on June 30th, Dunn called again and said Vince told him he had changed his mind and didn't want Carter brought back at all, not even for the Tacoma shows. No contract and no appearance on TV. At that point Lawler backed out. Lawler's side was that WWF had changed the deal 3 times, making it worse for Carter each time until eliminating her from the deal. WWF's side is that Lawler tried to change the deal to get her a downside and that she shouldn't have been part of the issue in signing him. After Lawler had decided not to return, Ross talked with Carter and told her that if Lawler came in, there was a chance that down the line they could use her but made no guarantees that would happen, and it would be in her and everyone's best interest for Lawler to return. However, the same impasse from day one remained. Lawler claimed that Bruce Pritchard was the one who went to Vince after he approved the deal, saying that the company is already experiencing enough problems in the locker room and bringing Carter back would make things worse. I do know that there was a lot of talk in the week after the decision was made to bring Lawler back and use him in the Tacoma angle that never happened, internally, which was very negative, feeling that it would publicly appear that Vince backed down to Lawler's demands if Carter was brought back and would send a bad message to talent. Not to mention her being around would be very bad for locker room morale. Nevertheless, on an issue such as this, or for that matter any major issue, while people can suggest all they want and McMahon no doubt heard plenty of different thoughts, ultimately the decision is going to be his. Raw on July 9th drew a 4.73 rating, 4.37 first hour, 5.08 second hour, and a 7.6 share. It was the highest rating for Raw dating back to April 30th, totaling 6.1 million viewers. The ratings pattern was identical with the previous 2 weeks. The consistent rise coincided with the introduction of WCW characters, and after 3 weeks it can't be called a fluke. However, the negative reaction to those characters from the live audience and no increase in ticket sales gives a contradictory message. The show had consistent growth throughout with only one down period, which ironically was right after the ECW angle for the X-Pac vs. Scotty match. The 2 big growth periods were 835,000 added viewers for the WWF, WCW, ECW Brawl, 5.61 rating, and 464,000 added viewers for Angle vs. Booker, 4.97. The ECW first angle itself drew a 5.09. There were major demographic shifts, however, week to week. Raw was down 22% among teenagers, but up 30% in males 18 to 24. SmackDown on July 6 drew a 3.8 rating, 4.4 realistic rating, finishing in its normal fourth place among the 6 networks. It was 80% rerun night with only one show, Millionaire, 8.1, even topping an 8 and 2 others, Friends and CSI, topping a 7. Raw on July 2 drew a 4.62 rating, 4.27 first hour, 4.94 second hour, and a 7.7 share, which translates into approximately 6 million viewers. The show started out stronger than it has in a long time, which shows anticipation. In addition, while not huge growth periods, the audience grew consistently throughout the show. There wasn't one down period, which is a very good sign. The growth was slow, with the exception of the overrun for the post-match ass-kicking of the WCW guys by the WWF and the Vince Torrey Wilson climax of sorts, 5.73 rating, which saw an increase of 906,000 viewers over the actual Booker vs. Bagwell match, 5.04. Tough Enough on July 5 drew a 2.02 rating and 3 share. For the weekend of July 7 to 8, Livewire did in 0.89, Superstars did in 0.84, and Heat did a 1.62 with X Factor, who theoretically shouldn't have that ratings pull. That's well up from previous shows, probably best explained because they shot a legitimate angle the week before. For the weekend of June 30th and July 1st, Livewire did in 0.85 rating, Superstars did in 0.92, and Heat did a 1.40. The Galavision Lucha Libre block on July 3 drew a 1.7 rating, which is back to normal levels. 5 years ago this week, the tenure of the Ultimate Warrior in the WWF ended under the most unusual circumstances, as he was suspended for missing house shows on the same weekend as both the blow-up with Vince McMahon and the death of his father. The case wound up as part of a messy lawsuit between the two parties that was settled out of court last year. Hellwig demanded that McMahon purchase a large amount of the monthly Ultimate Warrior comic book and handle distribution to fans. McMahon refused, and Hellwig no-showed events in both Detroit and Pittsburgh. After the Detroit show, but the day of Pittsburgh, Tom Hellwig, Jim's estranged father who he hadn't seen since the age of 3, passed away in South Florida. In both cities, ring announcer Bill Dunn announced that Warrior wouldn't be at the shows because he told the WWF he refuses to wrestle in a city like, fill in the blank, as a way to turn him babyface. Bret Hart, who at the time was retired from wrestling and pursuing an acting career, was called the morning of the Detroit show and asked to fill in, but that fell through, and instead, Sid Audi, Psycho Sid, who had been out of action for several months after his own problems with management, was brought back as an emergency replacement and filled in Warrior's program. Warrior himself after the weekend wanted to return and explained publicly his reasons for missing the dates was the death of his father, and that he would return for his scheduled house shows. As it turned out, Raw that Monday was pre-taped, headlined by Warrior vs. Owen Hart, which ended luckily enough for WWF storylines, with Warrior laid to waste by Team Cornette. Warrior had a strong comeback already taped for the Raw the following week, which never aired. WWF announced on TV, which was a shoot, that due to Warrior's frequent no-shows, they were asking him to post a $250,000 performance bond that he would forfeit in the event he missed a show. Naturally, he refused, which was expected, which was the WWF's way to publicly get rid of him without making it appear they were firing arguably their most popular babyface at the time. The breakup was even more messy since the WWF had sanctioned Warrior's training school in Phoenix as the first and only WWF-sanctioned wrestling school. In probably the most noteworthy story in the history of Japanese pro wrestling journalism, Tarzan Yamamoto, the editor of Weekly Pro Wrestling magazine for the previous 12 years, resigned. Yamamoto had been embroiled in a public feud with New Japan Pro Wrestling and booker Riki Choshu for some time, and by this point in time New Japan, War and UWFI had all banned the magazine from covering its events for several months. With magazine sales declining by 8% the previous month while rival Weekly Gong, which was allowed to cover those promotions, had a 16% increase, Yamamoto resigned. With all three promotions having so many major events planned for the summer and fall, pressure was on the magazine, which had increased coverage of All Japan, Michinoku, Rings, Pancrase, Garbage Wrestling, Women's Wrestling and American Wrestling to make up for the loss, and in particular the magazine attempted to get behind ECW. According to one book published on pro wrestling, Yamamoto had been labeled the most influential person in the entire pro wrestling world because of his pioneering in Japan the Observer approach, not all the way, but it was revolutionary for a mainstream magazine at that time of doing a more honest approach to covering matches, angles and behind-the-scenes news. While traditionalists claimed Yamamoto's approach was hurting the business, the reality was the Japanese business overall went through a major upswing in popularity during that period. He also differentiated between shoot groups and other groups, which he wouldn't go so far as to call worked, but the illusion was there. Yamamoto had bragged some months earlier in regard to his conflict with New Japan, that he had never lost a war in the past, noting that in previous conflicts with All Japan, War and SWS over the nature of his coverage, in all cases, the promotion ended up making amends to him because coverage in the most widely read wrestling magazine, 300,000 weekly circulation at its peak, was considered so important. Christine Rosati, a longtime WWF fan's best known as one of three sisters that Bobby Heenan joked about, passed away from the Eagly virus at the age of 47. Ratings saw Nitro at 3.3, Raw at 2.6, WCW Saturday Night at 2.1, WCW Pro at 1.4, Action Zone at 2.0 and Mania at 1.3. Former WCW champion Ron Simmons was set to debut in WWF with a huge push being managed by Sonny attempting to do the black stud/white woman heat angle that pretty much never worked. WWF introduced several new characters at the TV tapings in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Tom Brandi debuted as Salvatore Sincere, Tracy Smothers as Freddie Joe Floyd from Bowlegs, Oklahoma. Bowlegs, okay, is the small town where Jack and Jerry Briscoe grew up, and Jack's real name was Fred Joe Briscoe and Gerald's was Floyd Gerald Briscoe. Tony Anthony as T.L. Hopper, the plumber with a toilet plunger that he kisses as a gimmick. Alex Porto as the Pug, doing an amateur wrestler gimmick. Bill Irwin as the Goon, doing a hockey player gimmick, and Jim Neidhart as the masked man called Who. As the subject of numerous ideas for jokes, all long forgotten. After winning King of the Ring, the decision was made to give Steve Austin a mega push. 10 years ago this week, in what was perhaps the biggest news story of the year, NWA WCW World Champion Ric Flair was fired by WCW Vice President Jim Herd after a combination contract dispute and refusal to show up for a match where he was to drop the title to Barry Windham. The story was picked up on the AP and Knight Ridder national wires and ran around the country, getting huge coverage in North Carolina, at a time when pro wrestling news was never covered in newspapers. Flair had been negotiating to either get a contract extension or a contract release, which would enable him to go to the WWF immediately in the event an extension wasn't signed, in exchange for dropping the title. WCW was attempting to terminate Flair's contract, which paid him $700,000 per year, and sign him to a new 3-year deal which would pay him $350,000, $350,000 and $250,000 over the next 3 years. The company was going to also cut way back on the number of dates Flair would have to work as a way to justify the cut, because the company was losing money, and Flair, who has just turned 42, was at the time the company's highest paid wrestler. To show how things were at the time, Flair's offer was significantly less than a $400,000 per year over 3-year deal offered just a few months earlier to Sid Audi, who was believed more marketable, and who agreed to the deal and then turned it down to go to WWF when Vince McMahon promised Audi the main event at the next WrestleMania against Hulk Hogan. The offer to Flair was significantly less than a $500,000 per year offer made to Randy Savage 5 weeks earlier to Jump, which Savage turned down because it was less than he was already earning in the WWF. The plan had been for Flair to drop the title to Lex Luger at the Great American Bash pay-per-view show, but for fear Flair would no-show an important pay-per-view event, they switched plans and asked for Flair to drop the title 2 weeks earlier at a TV taping in Macon, Georgia to Windham, who, ironically enough, was wrestling without a WCW contract at a time when WWF and WCW were both in the market for stealing the other's talent. As was written at the time in The Observer, in order to avoid a possible major embarrassment, the company set up a situation that virtually guaranteed a major embarrassment. Flair was planning to no-show Macon, but the company made the decision for him by firing him several hours before the show in Macon started. Flair had regained the title from Sting in January at the Meadowlands. Sting had failed to be the answer to the company's problems. In 1989, many inside the company had blamed the aging Flair as champion, who, with the exception of a strong program with Terry Funk, hadn't drawn well, although he had what many consider his career best matches that year with Ricky Steamboat, for its financial problems, and thought putting the belt on Sting would turn the company around. Instead, Sting failed partially because he was following Flair, and with the spotlight thrust upon him as the focal point of the company for the first time, he wasn't able to live up to the Flair in-ring standard as champion, and his lone program with the Black Scorpion is remembered as one of those sad bad comedies of WCW. The belt was put back on Flair, but a few weeks later, Dusty Rhodes was brought back as booker. Rhodes booked Flair in only one new program during the year, with El Gigante, which guaranteed bad matches and screw job finishes, and worse, also didn't draw because Gigante wasn't ready for the spot. Flair's Sting had burned out by this point due to repetition. Flair also had a pay-per-view feud with Tatsumi Fujinami, but that would have been a hard sell under the best of circumstances, and instead they never even tried, so there was no interest in that. Even the Luger match they were pushing for the pay-per-view would have been tough because it would have been the 7th pay-per-view show with Flair Luger on top, advertised heavily as the Legend versus the Legacy. Politically, this led to the first NWA split from the WCW title, because the NWA, which didn't exist except on paper, refused to strip Flair of his title when Herd stripped him of the WCW title. Both titles were considered the same thing by this point. As it turned out, after it became clear Flair was going to WWF as a real world champion, since he left WCW without losing in a day when this was still important, although WWF botched that angle's potential up because they treated Flair's belt as a joke and refused to play up his legacy because it would violate Vince McMahon's cardinal rule at the time of acknowledging the competition. Herd went back to Flair with a new offer of $1.7 over 3 years that he likely would have signed for had it been offered before the blow-up and before he had given his word to McMahon for the long-talked-about dream program with WWF champion Hulk Hogan. But by the time Herd's new offer came in, the NWA belt had already appeared, in the hands of Bobby Heenan, Flair's original WWF manager, on the WWF syndicated shows, building anticipation for Flair's debut. When Flair finally appeared in September, the NWA officially stripped him of his title and there was no NWA champion for about a year until Bill Watts and Seiji Sakaguchi revived the title with a tournament in Japan. WCW officials had no idea the connection of Flair to the company, as over the next nearly 2 years, "We want Flair" chants echoed at house shows until finally Watts made the deal to bring Flair back after McMahon, living up to his word that he would let Flair return if at any time he was going to move him down from the main event status. Let Flair out of his contract. Wrestling was in such a boom period that on one night, June 15, 1991, more than 260 different wrestlers worked on shows in the Mexico City metropolitan area alone. A main event for the UWA in Naucalpan between El Hijo del Santo and Negro Casas for Casas UWA middleweight title was said to be the best match of the year thus far in Mexico. Chris Benoit, under a mask as Pegasus Kid, was working as a regular for UWA. He had just lost his mask in New Japan in a mask versus mask match against Jushin Liger in Fukuoka. Terry Gordy and Steve Williams won the All Japan double tag titles from Stan Hansen and Dan Spivey. Third-year pro Kenta Kobashi had a match of the year candidate against veteran Jumbo Tsuruta. An undercard feud in Memphis consisted of rookies Rob Satkuski, Rob Van Dam, against Samu, who later would be called Sabu. Carlos Colon beat Dino Bravo via DQ to headline the WWC Anniversary Show at the Ponce Baseball Stadium. There was a working agreement with WWF at the time which sent Bravo, Coco Ware, and Demolition in for the show. WCW had its largest gate thus far of the year at the Meadowlands, drawing 5,800 fans, paying $87,000, headlined by a War Games match with Luger and Sting, Yellow Dog, Brian Pillman, and Gigante over Kevin Sullivan and One Man Gang, and Barry Windham and Nikita Koloff. When Jim Ross was building up the War Games match on WCW TV, he said, in references to WWF cage matches, "It's not like those cage matches where the object is to run away. You know, the cage matches sanctioned by the Girl Scouts of America." The Jason Hervey/Paul E. Dangerously angle was dropped and forgotten in the storyline. WCW threatened to fire giant rookie Oz, Kevin Nash, because he refused to sign a new contract that would have only guaranteed him $300 per night with a minimum of 60 dates, but would have made him exclusive to the company. He ended up staying another 2 years before leaving and becoming a champion in the WWF. WWF held an outdoor show in Vancouver, BC, headlined by Hulk Hogan vs. Sergeant Slaughter, which only drew 5,500 fans. Some of the best WWF TV commentary in years was taking place with the announcing trio of Vince McMahon, Randy Savage, and Roddy Piper. This was the storyline of Savage wanting to ask Elizabeth to marry him. They'd in real life been married for years, and not having the guts, with Piper and McMahon giving him encouragement to suck it up. This angle played out over months, leading to a wedding as the co-feature of that year's SummerSlam from Madison Square Garden. For back issues of The Observer, the Wrestling Observer Index lists almost every issue in our history going back more than 17 years with the major headlines by the week. Besides as a guide for ordering back issues, the index is also a great way to keep a catalog of past issues and use for historical purposes. It is available for $15 from Grand Swarich, 151 Hart Avenue, Peterborough, Ontario, K9J5C5, Canada. Virtually every back issue from 1982-91 is available from him at prices listed plus $5 for postage for overseas orders. Most issues from 1991 present are available from us at $4 per issue. If you are ordering back issues from us, please denote back issues on the envelope to ensure the quickest response. All payments to Grant or to us must be made in U.S. funds. We are also working with Powerbomb Publishing, www.powerbomb.com, to have reissues of some of the most popular Wrestling Observer publications of the past. We have the 200-page book tributes, featuring life stories on Andre the Giant Bruiser Brody, Junkyard Dog Brian Pillman, Louis Piccoli, Dick the Bruiser, Buddy Rogers, Kerry Von Erich, Fritz Von Erich, Boris Malenko, Art Barr, Eddie Gilbert, John Studd, Ray Stevens, Dick Murdoch, Jerry Graham and others for $25. We have 1987, 1988, 1989 and 1990 Observer yearbooks for $15. We have 1983, 1984, and 1986 Observer yearbooks for $12. We also have the 1986 Wrestling Observer's Who's Who in Wrestling book for $20. For each order, add $4 for postage and handling within North America, $6 for surface mail worldwide or $14 for airmail overseas. If you are ordering more than one book, you only need to add $1 extra postage per additional book. All payments should be made to Powerbomb at P.O. Box 1523, Scarborough, North Carolina 27510. We're also on almost every Saturday night on Talk 640 in Toronto at about 6 p.m. Eastern Time and Sunday night at midnight for the Wrestling Observer Extra as part of live audio wrestling with Jeff Marek and Dan Lovronsky. Mexico. Lots of problems in AAA. A lot of the big names are looking to get out. There was a huge newspaper story about it talking about how the AAA headliners make far less than independent wrestlers, and that most of the top names are considering leaving. Antonio Pena did an interview and denied problems and called El Hijo del Diablo, who reportedly earns 4 times more per match on the indie scene, that Pena pays his headliners like Cibernetico overrated and overpaid. The weekly Sunday crowds at Arena Coliseo in Mexico City have been selling out the 5,500-seat gym so consistently that there is serious talk of moving them to Arena Mexico, which holds nearly 18,000. During the hot period of Lucha in the early 90s, EMLL ran both buildings on Sunday and ran Arena Mexico twice per week, usually drawing in excess of 10,000 fans on both shows. In 1993, when Antonio Pena formed AAA and EMLL lost many of its top drawing cards, they canceled the Sunday Arena Mexico shows because they were drawing so poorly. July 6th at Arena Mexico was headlined by Black Tiger and Mr. Niebla and Atlantis over Shocker and El Satanico and Black Warrior, when Satanico gave Atlantis a low blow for a DQ. What a novel finish. July 13th has Villano 3 and Lizmark Jr. and El Hijo de Rayo versus El Signo and Apollo Dantes and Dr. Wagner Jr., likely to shoot the angle for the V3 versus Signo hair match. EMLL is doing a house show on July 15th at Arena Coliseo in Mexico City, which will be Pero Aguayo's first appearance, angle alert, since his retirement and neck operation. They will be honoring Aguayo, plus recently deceased wrestlers Blue Demon and Villano 1 at the show. Must make Aguayo feel like he's got one foot in the grave as well as retired. Main event will be Mil Mascaras and Rayo de Jalisco Jr. and La Parca versus Los Hermanos Dinamita. They had a nearly sold-out house of 5,000 on July 6th in Tijuana for Promociones de Baja California. Chuck Palumbo was pulled from the show by the WWF, since he's working full-time for them. Ultimo Guerrero was brought in as a sub, teaming with Blue Panther and Pentagon and Dr. Wagner Jr. against Conan and La Parca and Nicho and Blue Demon Jr., which ended when Demon turned heel on the face team. Halloween and Damien and Rey Mysterio beat Los Hermanos Dinamita. Rival promoter Benjamin Mora has a show on July 20th with the return of Vampiro and Black Magic. There are already reports that Paco Alonso, EMLL president, has warned both promotions that run big shows in Tijuana besides AAA, Promociones de Baja California and Promociones de Mora, that if Conan appears on the shows, that all EMLL talent will be pulled from the show. Zumbito beat Mosco de la Merced to climax their long feud in Aguascalientes on July 6th in a hair versus hair match. Mosco suffered a legit neck injury and will be out of action for 3 months and is now in a cervical collar. Had to be rushed to the hospital after the match. The current wrestler Oro 2 in EMLL is not the Oro 2 from 1996, who was Plata, the original brother of the late Oro. This wrestler is a third brother, who was training to be a wrestler at the time of Oro's death. Puerto Rico. Big Vito started with WWC over the weekend, losing to Carly Colon in his debut on July 7th in Carolina. Another former member of ECW's Baldies, Angel Medina, starts soon for IWA. WWC owners Carlos Colon and Victor Jovica went to Croatia last week to attempt to plan a tour there later this year. Supposedly the WWC TV show, which airs on a 6-month delay, is a big hit there. Carly Colon also hasn't been around as he's been given a vacation. There was a legit problem between sometime woman wrestler La Tigresa, who has her own checkered past, and the wife of wrestler Lightning, which exploded in Humacao on July 1st. Alex Porto won the WWC TV title from Chris Grant on July 7th in Carolina. Russ McCulloch returned from his knee being scoped on the July 7th IWA show as a mystery opponent for Nuevo Gran Apolo, losing. Ratings for June 30th saw WWC at 13.4, IWA at 8.9 and WWF Metal at 10.4. All Japan. It is official that Yoji Anjo will be Genichiro Tenryu's partner in the tag title match on July 14th at Budokan Hall against Johnny Smith and Taiyo Kia. The challengers for the All-Asian Tag title held by Mitsuya Nagai and Masahito Kakihara were to be Nobutaka Araya and Shigeo Okamura, but that fell through as Kakihara tore up his right knee on the July 4th show in Matsuyama, and will be out of action for a while. Kakihara's had knee problems in the past, and apparently will be out long enough that they've vacated the belts. The proposed Toshiaki Kawada vs. Masahiro Chono match, which would have been the top-drawing match on the show, has been cancelled because of Chono's health problems. So the complete show is now Keiji Muto vs. Steve Williams for the Triple Crown, the tag title match, Kawada vs. Araya, Nagai vs. Okamura, Mike Barton and Jim Steele vs. Jinsei Shinzaki and Muhammad Yone, Yoshiaki Fujiwara and Ryuji Hijikata and Yuto Aima vs. George Hines and Iron Sheiks, Tiger Mask and Men's Teo vs. Gran Hamada and Hideki Nishida, and Masa Fuchi vs. Gran Naniwa vs. Nobukazu Hirai. This one looks like it'll be the one that has trouble drawing big. Tenryu is trying to open up relations between this group and 01 since the Noah/01 alliance seems to have fallen through before they could put together the Misawa vs. Hashimoto match. Bringing in Hashimoto would give Tenryu and Kawada a new big show opponent. They are also giving Tenryu a new finisher, called the Gu Punch, which is basically a punch to the face, as a knockout finisher. Kawada also wants to do a singles match with Riki Choshu, especially because of how disappointing their tag match was earlier this year at the Osaka Dome. Next tour will be August 26th to September 8th with a final show at Budokan Hall. Pro Wrestling Noah. Yuji Nagata will be at ringside for the Mitsuharu Misawa vs. Jun Akiyama GHC title match on July 27th at Budokan Hall as has been expected. The rest of the lineup for this company's biggest show in its history was announced as Yoshihiro Takayama, first match back since his Pride match with Kazuyuki Fujita, and Takao Omori vs. Takeshi Morishima and Takeshi Rikyo, which speaks volumes that Rikyo is this high on a card this early in his career. Yoshinobu Kanemaru defending the GHC Junior title against Donovan Morgan, Yoshinari Ogawa vs. Michael Modest, Akira Tao and Jun Izumida vs. Bull Schmidt and Vader, Daisuke Ikeda and Takuma Sano vs. Tamon Honda and Masao Inoue, Akitoshi Saito vs. Tsuyoshi Kikuchi, Namichi Marufuji and Takashi Sugawara vs. Two Cold Scorpio and Superstar Steve, Rusher Kimura and Mitsuo Momota vs. Haruka Eigen and Kishin Kawabata and Satoru Asako and Masashi Aoyagi vs. Kentaro Shiga and Makoto Hashi. They are attempting to book Dilip Singh, the 7-foot, 375-pound bodybuilder featured in magazine photos from All Pro Wrestling, who was being scouted by New Japan, for the October tour. The plan for now is to create GHC Tag Team Champions in an October tournament. Jardy France of APW was hospitalized over the past week because of a bad reaction to pain medication he got for an injured hand while in the last tour. New Japan. Masahiro Chono worked over the weekend and was expected to be off all house shows until the July 20th Sapporo Dome show due to his bowel illness. The details of the illness were largely being kept secretive, which is never a good sign. A lot of people were concerned on June 30th at Korakuen Hall when Chono was unusually exhausted and looked really bad after his match. Perhaps as an angle to explain his absence, on his final booking, which was July 8th in Kishiwada in a tag match where Yuji Nagata and Manabu Nakanishi beat Chono and Scott Hall, the finish saw Nakanishi pin Chono after a spear. Chono clutched his stomach and stayed in the ring until he was carried off on a stretcher holding his stomach. The New Japan trainer named Misawa, no relation, said he aggravated a previous back injury and was in tremendous pain in the dressing room before going to the hospital. He said that until Chono gets checked out, they can't assume he'll be ready for the Sapporo Dome show. At this point there is serious talk that Chono, due to all his problems, won't wrestle full-time again and concentrate on booking and only working big shows. What was strange about all this is that Nagata publicly claimed it was all an angle. One of the big problems with New Japan right now is that all of the top guys on the big shows, Muto, Ogawa, Choshu, Hashimoto, Fujita and now Chono, don't work the full house show schedule, making the house shows in a sense come across like B shows, similar to what killed WCW house show business. Only difference is the guys who do come have a better work rate, and they at least don't false advertise in the local market so the fans who buy the tickets don't leave feeling ripped off. Antonio Inoki claimed he would be promoted a second Peace Festival in North Korea in the fall or winter. In 1995, Inoki promoted 2 shows in Pyongyang, North Korea that drew more than 150,000 fans, which was the original Peace Festival. Riki Choshu had his first match back since the disaster at the Fukuoka Dome on July 6 in Okayama in a 6-man teaming with Fujinami and Nakanishi over Kojima and Tenzan and Michiyoshi Ohara when Choshu pinned Kojima after a lariat. Choshu wasn't announced as returning ahead of time for this show, which was TV taping which aired the next night. Main event on the show had Chono and Scott Hall over Muto and Jinsei Shinzaki when Chono pinned Muto, which was to set up their Sapporo Dome main event. June 30th TV show was a quick turnaround, airing matches from earlier that day at Korakuen Hall. Not a great lineup on paper, but for action it was good and every match seemed to get its purpose over. Liger and Wataru Inoue and Katsuyori Shibata beat Negro Casas and Geto and Jado. Great match. Shibata juiced. Geto in particular looked much smaller than in the past. A lot of brawling with Geto and Jado. It's amazing when it comes to basics and solid working how inexperienced New Japan guys like Inoue and Shibata are so much better than 11-year indie guys like Geto and Jado, which speaks volumes for their methods of training. Casas looked like the Casas of old. Finish saw Shibata score his biggest career win, pinning Casas after a German suplex to a huge pop. 4 stars. Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto and Hiro Saito beat Nagata and Shiro Koshinaka and Shinya Makabe. Pretty edited. Purpose seemed to be to push Ohara as a UFC-style guy and get over his new front guillotine submission. He got it on Nagata, who was dead, but made the ropes. Finish saw Makabe spear Ohara, but Ohara grabbed the move as a counter and choked him out for the win. So-so match but clever finish. Muto and Kia beat Chono and Super J. Muto got a huge reaction coming out with the 3 belts. Better match than it looked on paper because Muto knows what to do and Kia has awesome kicks. Muto pinned Jay with the Shining Wizard. Chono didn't do much. He looked somewhat sick in the ring but not alarmingly bad. Geto and Jado did a run-in attacking Muto's knees until Liger and Nishimura saved. Williams then did the surprise run-in and gave Muto the Dr. Bomb and laid out Liger and Kia as well. Williams looked out of shape but it's a fresh angle and people popped for it. 3 stars main was Tenzan and Kojima over Yoshi and Nakanishi to keep the IWGP tag titles in 2202. About half the match aired. Tenzan and Kojima are the best, because Yoshi has nothing and Nakanishi is limited as well, but they got a good match out of them. The spots that seem to really pop the crowd are double submissions. Kojima carried the match big time. Good spot where Nakanishi held Kojima in the front guillotine, the new hot hold in Japan, while Yoshi tried to Charlie horse his hamstring as a setup for Yoshi's reverse figure 4. Nakanishi then racked Tenzan while Kojima was caught and Kojima did an awesome sell job before making the ropes. They did another big spot when Yoshi got a camel clutch on Tenzan while Nakanishi racked Kojima, but Tenzan made the ropes. Crowd totally was into Kojima and Tenzan as the faces. Finish saw Tenzan hit Yoshi with a Tenzan driver and a moonsault for the pin. Team 2000 posed in the ring after the match. 3 1/2 stars. June 30th TV show did a 1.9 rating. Other Japan notes. Atsushi Onita officially announced he would be running for the House of Councilors as a member of the Jiminto Party, which is the biggest political party in Japan. Onita is building a platform around children's education, since he was well known for getting his high school diploma by going back to school at about the age of 40 after dropping out at 15 to become a pro wrestler. The national election is July 29th. On July 7th, in a publicity maneuver, Onita went to the Rikitozen grave site and held 3 of his explosive barbed wire deathmatch tapes and said he was going to send them to Premier Junichiro Koizumi. He then said after he wins the election, he's going to visit Antonio Inoki and challenge him for what would be his retirement match. And you think politics in our country is silly? Well, I guess Rob Black did run for mayor of LA, but Onita is going to get a hell of a lot more votes and got a hell of a lot more pub than he ever did. Chihiro Date, who won a gold medal at 162 pounds in freestyle wrestling in the 1976 Olympics in Montreal, had a press conference on July 9 and announced he would be starting up a new promotion called World Martial Arts Group. Inoki has an involvement in this one as well, and they named Satoru Sayama and Yoshiaki Yatsu as directors of the group. For whatever it's worth, former wrestler and sumo star Koji Kiao appeared at the opening party. All Japan women have a big show on July 27 at Tokyo Yoyogi Gym with the main event billed as Kaoru Ito, the current WWA champ, traditional top belt in women's pro wrestling, versus Erin Toril, a women's shoot fighter who worked the two remix shows and is best known for beating Megumi Yabushita in a shoot fight in May, in what is billed as a Valley Tudo match. Ito has been wrestling every day even though she suffered a broken jaw and a broken nose. Ito did a 30-minute draw with Momoe Nakanishi in the Grand Prix tournament on July 8 at Korakuen Hall, which was headlined by Mima Shimoda pinning Manami Toyota also in a tournament match. Nakanishi, who is the best young woman wrestler in the world, turned 20 the previous day. They also have 2 matches with Japanese female amateur wrestlers facing pros under amateur rules, so I presume they'll also be shoot matches, as well as WWA tag titles with Itsuko Mita and Shimoda defending against Tomoko Watanabe and Nani Takahashi. Right now in the Japan Grand Prix tournament, Shimoda leads with 10 points, Fumiko Maekawa has 8, Nakanishi has 7 and Manami Toyota, Miho Wakizawa, Mita and Yumiko Hata have 6. AJW also will start training 3 new women from their annual audition, not unlike the Tough Enough audition WWF did, who are Tomoko Mori, 23, Chiemi Kitagami, 18, and Tamakio Yumane, 17. Battle Arts ran Korakuen Hall on July 5, with a 1 vs 3 match with Yuki Ishikawa facing Masato Tanaka and Geto Injado. Ishikawa is a 1980s New Japan fan, so this was his attempt at doing the remake of a famous early 80s match when Antonio Inoki faced Rusher Kimura, Animal Hamaguchi and Osamu Teranishi in a 1-on-3, which was actually a huge deal at that time. Ishikawa was pinned, but then after the match, Kazunari Murakami did a run-in saving him and attacked Tanaka. Also Pride's Daijiro Matsui teamed with Karl Malenko over Ikuto Hidaka and Shinjiro Otani in a match designed to build something with Otani versus Matsui, and Katsumi Yujuda upset Tatsuhito Takaiwa with an ankle lock. Great Sasuke defends the NWA middleweight title against Curryman, Christopher Daniels, on July 21 in Akita. Company is building its shows around Great Sasuke vs Dick Togo as the main feud. New Japan will be sending several wrestlers to the August 19 Michinoku Pro Show, with a main event of Muto, doing a new Great Muto-like character, and Jinsei Shinzaki doing the Hakushi character against 2 wrestlers from New Japan's Team 2000. Tanaka also challenges Kamikaze for the Big Japan title on July 27 at Korakuen Hall. The next Big Japan tour from July 27 to August 19 features John Zandig, Wife Beater, Justice Payne, Madman Pondo, Johnny Kashmere, Trent Acid and Nate Hatred from CZW. There was a ladder match with Zandig vs Jun Kasai on June 25, which saw them shatter a glass window and Kasai took a bump of the ladder onto a barbed wire board and Kasai's back ended up about as shredded as that sick match he did in CZW many weeks back. Darkness Dragon and Yasushi Kanda and Susumu Mochizuki won the Uwa Trios titles from Chima and Suwa Intaro on July 8 at the Toryuman show at Differ Ariake. Takashi Okamura is doing a gimmick where they pretend he's the president of Toryuman, so in the main event, Okamura and Magnum Tokyo wrestled Masaki Mochizuki and Chocolate K. Aichi, where if Mochizuki's team won, he'd take over as president, but Mochizuki ended up getting pinned. Next major show is July 20th at Hakata Star Lanes with a pay-per-view rematch with Tokyo defending the British Junior title against Masaki Mochizuki. They run Korakuen Hall on August 14th, with a 3-way trios match for the Uwa belts. Here and there. The International Wrestling Institute and Museum added 4 members to its Hall of Fame a few weeks ago, as noted here previously. The induction ceremony was on June 16 in Newton, Iowa, the home of the Hall of Fame, which inductees are hand-picked by Luthez. The honorees were Farmer Burns, William Muldoon, Tim Wooden, and Jack Briscoe. Burns was known for discovering and coaching Frank Gotch, and many consider him the father of American pro and amateur wrestling. Muldoon, billed as world champion in Greco-Roman wrestling from 1880-91, was the most influential pro wrestler of the 1800s. Tim Woods, was AAU national champion at 191 pounds while attending Ithaca College in 1955 and in 1957 while attending Michigan State, as well as placing second in the NCAA for Michigan State at 177 in 1958 and at 191 in 1959. Interesting note that the 4th place finisher in that same tournament was also later a pro wrestling star, Adnan Kazi of Oklahoma State. He became a huge pro star, particularly in Georgia during the 60s and 70s, probably even more famous under the white mask as Mr. Wrestling, including drawing the first sellout for a pro wrestling event at the Omni in 1973 for a title match where he challenged NWA champion Harley Race. Briscoe was the 1965 NCAA champion and was arguably the biggest star on a worldwide basis in pro wrestling during the early 70s, particularly from 1973-75 when he held the NWA World Heavyweight title twice and from 1970-73 when he was generally considered the top contender and had the legendary series of matches against champion Dory Funk in one of pro wrestling's all-time great rivalries. Briscoe was unable to attend the induction due to his health problems, but did accept via speakerphone. Another former pro wrestler, Tom Drake, was given the Frank Gotch Award for a pro wrestler who brought great honor to the sport. Drake was a college wrestling and football star, who was something of a pro star in the Southeast and later served 9 terms in the Alabama state legislature, including becoming Speaker of the House. Honky Tonk Man and the Bushwhackers pulled out of their UK tour with the Wrestling Alliance 9 days early. HTM claimed that promoter Scott Conway, who he called the most dishonest guy we've ever worked for, think about the ground they would cover, tried to change the agreed-upon deal, although did say Conway paid them for the dates they worked. Apparently Honky was making about £360, roughly $500, per show, plus he was augmenting that income by making £200 to £300 per show doing the Polaroid gimmick. Because the crowds were far less than expected, Conway went to all 3 and asked if he could get the money from their gimmick sales. They, of course, said no. He then called and made arrangements to send them home early. Kevin Nash did a lengthy interview in Americana, a Japanese magazine. It was quite funny. He credited himself and Scott Hall with helping the young guys in the business get over because they realized when they broke in how shitty the veterans were because nobody would elevate them. He mentioned in WCW how he was specifically told not to mention Hall's name on TV, so he did it every week. At one point they told him if he did it again they were going to fire him on a breach. He gave them a big speech about the Constitution and freedom of speech. It's so funny. Like the Constitution guarantees you the right on a television show to go against the script and still keep your job. But right or wrong doesn't matter because they never fired him, so at that point after a warning and a threat and doing nothing, Nash is no longer at fault. The company was for letting it continue. Nash said he was thinking of retiring after his current contract runs out, but now he's hungry and misses the pop. He said he told the bookers in WCW that you have to lay a foundation in your storylines. Too many run-ins. Said that WWF never lost the basis of the ultimate quest to win the belt. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch ran a huge story a few weeks ago on whatever happened to Harley Race. They claimed he was the biggest draw in St. Louis in the 70s. Actually, Bruiser Brody and Dick the Bruiser were, but the belt was the biggest draws and Race held it longer than anyone, so you could make that claim. Talked about Race training and promoting wrestling with his WLW group. Story claimed that before Race, sweaty grapplers played to a relatively small, but loyal and dedicated group of fans. After Race, wrestling is a mega-billion-dollar industry with huge television contracts, pay-per-view spectacles and a sleazy soap opera sensibility. In St. Louis they wrote that. The same city where Wrestling at the Chase would go head-to-head with NFL football on Sundays and equal its ratings, and later when not opposing the NFL often did a 60 share in its time slot. I guess the NFL also had a relatively small, but loyal and dedicated group of fans in those days. Race claimed he started wrestling at the age of 15 when he got in a fight in high school, and the principal told him to stop. He didn't hear him, so the principal gave him a knee to the head and yelled at him with a sneer, so he punched the principal. Talked about him being the driver to Happy Humphrey, a supposed 800-pound wrestler who was a big attraction in those days, which was his first job in wrestling. He claimed he helped bring pro wrestling to Turner's network in the mid-70s. Everyone claims that. I think anyone but Jim Barnett or Ann Gunkel probably don't deserve any credit for it. He claimed he ran Georgia wrestling from 1972 to 1974. He said he quit wrestling in 1996 because it was no fun, but now it's fun doing what he's doing. Matrats released a lineup for a July 29th house show in Calgary, which is something of a test run for the proposed October pay-per-view show. Jason Hervey will be the on-air commissioner, which has its good and bad points. The bad is obvious to anyone who remembers Hervey as a short-lived Nitro announcer. The good is that at least he is very good on camera and has years of experience in acting. Best guys are said to be Jack Evans, Vince Hall, who did the 540 Centon on the pilot tape, Ted Hart, T.J. Wilson and Rene Dupree, who is the son of longtime Maritimes promoter Emile Dupree, is said to be 18 years old and a shredded 250 pounds, and people who have seen him say he could be the next megastar of the business. Dupree vs. Harry Smith will be the main event. Joey Styles is the leading candidate for announcer for this group. The group actually had the most underrated announcer in the business in Mauro Ranallo, who used to do a hell of a job with Bad News Allen for Stampede Wrestling a year back. The first pro wrestling event at the Westchester County Center in White Plains, New York in about 18 months was a total bomb, as 313 fans showed up in the 3,800-seat arena for a card promoted by Charles Rapp Entertainment, which included a lot of top local talent, including Backseat Boys and Low Key, as well as a big-name double main event with Jerry Lawler over Road Dogg and Brian Christopher over Spellbinder plus Crowbar. Stacey Carter, Jasmine St. Clair and Blue Meanie worked underneath. For the second weekend in a row, there is a story about a fire spot going awry and an injury. At the XPW show on July 7th at the Grand Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles before about 1,100 fans, during a death match with Supreme and Chaos, after Supreme went through a table filled with light bulbs, Veronica Kane, one of the porn stars they use as valets for the promotion, put way too much charcoal lighter fluid, usually in pro wrestling they use regular lighter fluid because it burns faster, on the table, said to be the entire can, and Supreme took the bump face first. Supreme ended up on fire. He began shaking and rolling, which only made the fire worse. A guy with a fire extinguisher panicked and sprayed the table, which was also burning still, while Supreme was burning. Eventually he was sprayed after about 10 seconds, which is a long time under those conditions. He was badly burned on his chest and arms and laid on the ground for about 10 minutes before he was taken out by paramedics to the hospital. Some of the fans were very respectful as he was taken out, saying things like, "I hope you die," and "Anyone for barbecue," and "I smell bacon." Reportedly, Kane has never participated in a fire spot previously. Last reports are that Supreme is expected to be hospitalized for about 1 week. There was a long delay in the show, which had one match left, a three-way for the XPW title where Messiah retained over Sabu and Vampiro. Promoter Rob Black, while all the problems with Supreme were going on, was downstairs trying to talk Sabu into doing the job in the three-way. He was refusing until right at match time, and the main event was booked on the fly after ICP, who were supposed to be involved in the match with Vampiro, had already walked out of the building after being mad at the stiff shot Pogo the Clown gave Violent J in the angle that opened the show. Stiff enough that Jay is now said to have broken 2 ribs. All that was said at the show was over the PA that they would update people on Supreme's condition on TV this coming weekend. It was reported that the entire building stunk from lighter fluid and burned flesh. Vampiro, in his first match back after his latest career-ending injury, was nowhere close to 100%. Sabu looked bad as well. Sandman was the star of the show, making his XPW debut doing a run-in to save Major Guns, who was being attacked by Lizzie Borden and an Asian woman. What was funny that because of Sandman and New Jack, the loudest chants on the show were ECW Sandman beat Vic Grimes and drank beer with Major Guns after the match. After the main event, where Sabu did get pinned by Messiah, all of Rob Black's guys came out to attack Sabu until Sandman made the save for them. In South Carolina, the Athletic Commission has raised the price for permits to promote from $50 to $250, which will have a major impact because so many of the indie groups draw about 100 fans per show. However, for those who run frequently, there is a break, as a 1-year permit is $1,000 and a 6-month permit is $500. The APW King of the Indies tournament on October 26th and October 27th in Vallejo, California looks to have as its 16 guys: Christopher Daniels, Michael Modest, Donovan Morgan, AJ Styles, Reckless Youth, Doug Williams, Vic Capri, Scoot Andrews, Mark Smith, American Dragon, Chad Collier. Red Bastion on Wrestling Observer Live said the Cauliflower Alley Club would be sending a lot of top stars to attend as well, mentioning himself, Nick Bockwinkel, Bobby Heenan, Mike Tenay, Pepper Gomez, and Don Manukian, a former Stanford and Oakland Raiders football player in the early 60s who was Ray Stevens' tag team partner and best friend during that period. Independent wrestlers that will be appearing at the Brian Pillman Memorial Show on August 9th in Cincinnati include local HWA wrestlers Ray Steele, Pepper Parks, Nigel McGuinness, Chad Collier, Shark Boy and Steve Bradley, as well as OVW wrestlers Rico Constantino, Doug Basham, Flash, Randy Orton, Nick Dinsmore, Brock Lesnar, Shelton Benjamin and Disciples of Sin, Stampede's Richard Pound, it was J.R. Ryder, APW's Donovan Morgan and Reckless Youth. Combat Zone Wrestling on July 7th in Sewell, New Jersey changed their main angle in the match with Wifebeater vs. Justice Payne for the CZW title. Payne and Wifebeater were regular tag partners. Johnny Kashmere then hit Wifebeater with a baseball bat. Payne protected his partner. John Zandig ran in but Kashmere hit him with a bat. Trent Acid also turned on Zandig and went back with Kashmir to reform their Backseat Boys tag team. Nick Mondo ran in to save Zandig but was beaten down as well. Payne then pinned Wifebeater and joined with the Backseat Boys against Zandig, Mondo, and Wifebeater. The WWF developmental talent, Christian York, Joey Matthews, Lance Cade, Spanky, American Dragon, Oz Brothers, Steve Bradley, Joey Abs and Island Boys, finished up for Memphis Championship Wrestling this weekend. On the final show, which was July 7th in Manila, Arkansas, first Bradley beat Abs to win the Southern title, and in the main event, Seven, a local wrestler who is staying, beat Bradley for the belt. MCW is going to keep going using local talent since Terry Golden owns his own production equipment and will be able to film for the TV time slot without incurring the usual huge costs. The CZW TV show started airing in Philadelphia. The talent is really good, but the production is said to be pretty bad. There was what was called an ECW reunion show on July 8th in Buffalo before about 700 fans. Show was both happy and sad because it was already nostalgia and both good and bad because of it. The fans who were there were really into everyone. Most of the matches were said to be good for the wrestling, except the main event, which was Dreamer vs. C.W. Anderson, which was played more for comedy, although it was enjoyable at that. Dreamer, who gave no indication he was going to Atlanta the next day for the real ECW reunion, came out to Flair's entrance music. Sabu looked like a total mess beating Angel. Also on the show were Danny During, Roadkill, FBI, Balls Mahoney, Jack Victory, Mikey Whipwreck, Johnny Swinger, Nova, Chris Chetty, Tom Marquez, and Chili Willy. The Chicago Fantasy Camp that was mentioned last week as being postponed now pretty much seems to be a dead issue, at least in the form it was planned. It may be done but with a lot lower talent budget. NWO Florida ran a 12-man Super Junior Open tournament using local wrestlers as well as Jason Rumble from New England, Reckless Youth, Jimmy Rave of Wildside, Christopher Daniels and Tony Kozina from the Northwest. It came down a three-way with Lex Lovett winning over Daniels and Scoot Andrews. MMA. The actual paid attendance for the June 29th UFC show at the Meadowlands was about 6,000, paying $340,994, so the building was roughly half paid and half paper. Virtually the entire card was announced for the July 29th Pride show at the Saitama Super Arena. The new matches are Ebenezer Fontes Braga vs. Daijiro Matsui, Igor Vovchankin vs. Masaaki Sadake, Kazushi Sakuraba vs. Quinton Jackson, Valid Ismail vs. Shungo Oyama, Mark Coleman vs. Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, Mark Kerr vs. Heath Herring and Valentij Novarim vs. Asirio Silva. The only other match official is Ryan Gracie vs. Tokumitsu Ishizawa, Kendo Kashin. Very disappointing lineup for such a major show. During the week they also mentioned Kevin Randleman debuting, and Wanderlei Silva appearing, but not sure if those matches are still to be added. Braga has been doing K1 of late and is known in Japan because he pounded on Masakatsu Funaki when Funaki did one of his first Vale Tudo matches, but was then submitted by Sakuraba. Vovchankin vs. Sadake is a likely a stand-up fight. May be entertaining but everyone expects Igor to win handily. Jackson may be a real bad idea for Sakuraba. He has a 9-1 record in King of the Cage and his lone loss was said to be a controversial decision. At 205 pounds, he will outweigh Sakuraba by 20 pounds, but he has no name, so Sakuraba will gain nothing by beating him. To get this unknown over in Japan, they are portraying him as a street fighter and sort of alluding he's a gang thug type. Ismail is an old-school Brazilian jiu-jitsu star who had a big name as a bad man because of a match with Royler Gracie, then 40 minutes in Brazil before this stuff got famous. His main claim to fame was choking out Royce Gracie a few years ago but lost to Akira Shoji in Pride after that. Coleman vs. Nogueira is one of those matches that insider fans love, but doesn't have big drawing power. Coleman won the Pride Heavyweight Tournament last year and Nogueira won the Rings King of Kings Tournament this year, so while not billed as anything, it's almost like an interpromotional world title match. Herring vs. Kerr is an interesting match in that if there is a clean finish, somebody is elevated. It's really Kerr's last big chance. Don't know anything about Silva other than he's from the same shoot boxing team in Brazil that produced Wanderlei Silva and Pele and is said to be a strong heavyweight and a very good Muay Thai fighter. The proposed idea seems to be to run the company's biggest show in history on November 3rd at the Tokyo Dome with a triple main event of Nobuhiko Takada vs. Naoya Ogawa, Coleman vs. Kazuyuki Fujita, and Sakuraba vs. Silva. One of the Vale Tudo matches K1 was trying to put together for the August 19th Saitama Super Arena show was Kazuyuki Fujita vs. Mirko Krikop. It probably won't happen because some of the MMA guys said Krokop would probably get creamed, and that's not what K1 wants from one of its top guys. New Japan's Don Fry and Brian Johnston have both expressed interest in doing UFC. Fry was trying to get a match with Randy Couture, but UFC wanted Fry to score at least one major win before getting a title match. Former WCW promoter Zane Breslov, who reached a financial contract settlement with America Online regarding the remainder of his contract, has now officially signed up with Pride as its U.S. promoter. Frank Shamrock may be done as a UFC announcer. His contract ended with the last show and they negotiated for a new deal, but he didn't want to sign it because it was an exclusive deal, meaning he couldn't announce for any other show. Shamrock is currently a serious training. At this point his most likely destination is doing a Vale Tudo rules fight on a K1 show in Japan. UFC officials are very negative about the idea of using Tank Abbott, even after his Time Warner contract expires. While there is an argument that he can be a one-time attraction as a comeback, and be put in there with somebody like Josh Barnett, who they are looking to build, to give the guy something of a rep for beating Abbott, but the feeling seems to be that they've argued with commissions they're a real sport and bringing in Abbott, who there is no guarantee would show up in shape, goes against what they've wanted to portray the sport as. Boxing gets away with freak shows as pay-per-view undercards, whether it be Layla Ali, Butterbean or Mia St. John. But boxing is established and there is a lot it can get away with that UFC can't. Next K1 is July 20th from Nagoya Rainbow Hall with yet another 8-man tournament seemingly designed to result in Mike Bernardo vs. Cyril Abidi as the finalists. WWF early estimates on King of the Ring are a 1.05% buy rate, which would be about 450,000 buys. WrestleMania as a final number was the all-time record for a pro wrestling pay-per-view, with a final figure appearing to be around 900,000 buys, which is about 10% less than the last reported estimate. There are no final numbers in for any pay-per-view since Mania. The Goldberg situation appears to be dormant at this point. Because of his current deal, to sign him would require him having the highest contract in the company, and the company isn't going to disrupt its salary scale and create a locker room issue over it, no matter how one may be able to economically justify the deal in this case. It's not a given he'd be worth it, but if he was put over strong, you'd really only need 3 huge buy rates, or 1 huge buy rates and some good house show drawing and merchandising power to make up for it. He could not get over big enough to sustain his drawing power, or he could get hurt and not work enough to justify the downside. It's a precedent clearly the company isn't willing to take. Bagwell was fired before Nitro in Atlanta. He was let go for an amazing ability to accumulate heat in almost record time. This was for all the reasons mentioned last week as well as some others. There was the issue with Helms reported on last week, which left him with some stitches, and started him off on a bad foot because the feeling was Helms was a quiet, hard-working guy being made fun of and slapped, and that Helms was only defending himself when he did his comeback. Bagwell still had a good-sized gash on his head when he showed up for TV in Atlanta. Bagwell also arrived late for the practices almost every day in Stamford, Connecticut to get used to the new ring, and was said to be the only one not taking the practices seriously. He also arrived late for the house show in Spokane. The original plan was for Bagwell to work the weekend house shows against Morris and put him over, but the decision was made to pull him from the bookings and put Jindrak in. Even though that was an office decision, most of the wrestlers were under the impression he had called in sick, so to speak. At the second night in Tacoma, after the show went off the air, they set up an angle where the WCW crew that was doing the beatdown in the back on Undertaker, Stasiak, Canyon, Bagwell, Awesome, EDP, would come back in the ring, and the NWOB team guys, Bradshaw's crew, would run them off. It was set up for all the WCW guys to run off, leaving only Bagwell in the ring, for what appeared to be the typical APA legit punishment, as he was powerbombed very hard and complained afterwards of a neck injury. They didn't want a situation where he may have said the wrong word to someone, since he has so much heat with so many of the wrestlers that it caused a scene, plus felt Jindrak was younger and has more long-term potential, so it doesn't hurt to give him the experience. Bradshaw was ribbing Bagwell hard about his mother, legendary former tag team champion Judy Bagwell, calling the office and complaining about Buff's travel reservations on more than one occasion. There was even a pool among some of the wrestlers as to how long he'll last. Most of the over/under predictions seemed to be Labor Day, although one person actually had it as early as July 4th, only missing by 5 days. Somebody also punched a hole in Bagwell's hat. A very memorable Raw took place on July 9th in Atlanta at Phillips Arena. The night of swerves opened with a scheduled DDP vs. Shane street fight. Undertaker and Sarah came out, and Undertaker said he wanted Paige. Shane agreed to step aside. After Taker pounded Page for a brief period of time, Shane turned on Undertaker. Undertaker made his own comeback on Shane until Page hit him with chair shots to the back and head. Sarah attacked Shane with kendo stick shots, getting it from Shane. Page gave Sarah the diamond cutter. This was the first actual real heat this angle had gotten. Page then drove off on Undertaker's bike while Undertaker and Sarah left for the hospital, which was a way to keep the main event guys out of the closing angle. APA won the tag titles from Dudley's in 5:08 when Spike hit Bubba with his crutch and Bradshaw pinned him after the lariat. Not good. Dudley's turn really didn't take since fans were cheering the "was up" spot, even without being played to, and when Bubba got the table. The heat for most of the matches on the show was disappointing, and this was no exception. Vince, Austin, Deborah and Angle continued their comedy routine. Austin now repeats everything Vince says. Then when Angle tries to do the same thing, Austin yells at him. Angle got everyone little sheriff stars that a kid would wear and gave himself a gold badge to match his medal. Austin thought it was pathetic and uttered a movie line, "We don't need no stinkin' badges," which got a pop. Austin teased Angle about getting his ass whipped by Booker to set up their match. Albert pinned Rhino to keep the IC title in 3:09 with a high kick. Rhino earlier kicked out of X-Pac's interference. Albert looked huge next to Rhino. Angle challenged T. T ignored him but finally accepted. Even by his recent levels, Angle was really portrayed as a geek. Show destroyed Jeff Hardy in 1:39. No heat. Hardy went for a Hurricane Rana but Show blocked it and turned it into a flapjack. Trish kissed Jeff after the match. Angle and Austin then argued over who was Gilligan and who was the skipper out of the two, both agreeing that Vince was Thurston Howell, references from Gilligan's Island. Seriously. If they want 60s references, they might as well have brought back Heenan. Jericho came out and wanted to join Austin and Angle's team for the invasion. They blew him off, making him seem like a geek as well. Earth to WWF fans want their babyfaces at least portrayed as cool guys who don't back down from adversity. Jericho said he'd been in WCW and didn't want to go back. Earth to Vince. You own WCW. T pinned Angle in 7:49 to keep the WCW title. T came out with both the WCW and US belts. Booker was booed even against geeky Angle. Not that anyone was surprised by that, because they scripted it with Booker as the heel with Shane interfering and Nick Patrick playing heel ref. Wow, heel ref 2 weeks into the interpromotional feud. Next thing you know, they'll have WCW and WWF join forces before the end of the show. Fans didn't really want to cheer Angle either, but they did by the end because of the scripting. It was a good match, but not as good as most of Angle's TV matches. Booker just didn't rise to the occasion. Angle got the ankle lock but Patrick was distracted by Shane and missed the tap. Angle also did the Angle slam after a weak ref bump. Earl Hebner tried to make the count but Patrick stopped him. Hebner and Patrick went at it. Shane gave Booker the belt and Booker hit Angle with it, and with the two refs fighting, Charles Robinson ran in and counted the pin. They're doing a better job of WWF versus WCW with the refs than the wrestlers. Angle after the match went back to doing his comedy routine, asking where Vince and Austin were, after earlier telling them he was in Atlanta, the city he won his gold medal in, and he was going to win the title by himself. When they brought up what he had said, he said that he didn't mean it. Wilson and Keebler did an interview setting up the bra and panties match. Wilson is one of the few women in the business who can talk. She cut a good promo about how disgusting Vince was. Kane and Jericho beat Awesome and Storm via DQ in 7:06 with the ECW run-in. It was supposed to be a handicap match. Jericho simply came out, without even doing an interview to explain why he was involved. Awesome and Storm looked like race steel coming down the aisle for heat. Zero heat for the WWF versus WCW aspect since crowd was quiet early. As it turned out, the match after about 5 minutes had the most heat of any match on the show because they used old school tag team psychology, with Jericho getting pounded on and Kane making the hot tag. Kane and Storm didn't work well at all together. Jericho had the walls on Storm when Dreamer and Van Dam ran in for the DQ. Rhino, Taz, Credible, Dudleys and Raven went to make the save, but then turned on Kane and Jericho and laid them out. Heyman then hit the ring and explained that ECW was back. At least he did the exact interview needed to get the thing off the ground. Van Dam was either ultra careful on Kane, or simply way off because he did one of the weakest looking Van Daminators in a long time. Shane and Vince then agreed that WWF and WCW would band together because they both hated ECW in the main event. X-Pac kept the LTHWT title over Too Hotty in 4:23, holding the ropes for the pin. Vince and Shane and the WWF and WCW teams argued over which would be captain. It was like a convention for large uncharismatic guys with the APA. Actually, they have a unique charisma. Show, Gunn, Bob Holly, Jindrak, Palumbo, O'Hare, Canyon, and Stasiak. The future of this business depends upon whether they can make some of these newcomers stars, and I almost see this as like WCW at the end, where they throw so much out there with no strong introductions hoping something would stick, and by doing so, almost nothing ever sticks. WWF and WCW were to join forces, but they didn't even get the match started before they fought, and it only took 20 seconds for WWF to clear the ring. ECW with 10 guys attacked WWF with 5 with a beatdown, and WCW teased the save, but of course joined ECW key spots where O'Hare laying out Bradshaw and Dudley's with 3D on Farouk and another lousy Van Daminator on Gunn. Show ended with the announcement that Stephanie now owns ECW. Storylines continued with what sounded like a hot SmackDown show. In the first dark match, Kaz Hayashi and Yun Yang beat Shannon Moore and Evan Karagias in the debut for all 4. Yang pinned Karagias with Yang time, and crowd was really into this match, which marks the first time that has been the case for a WCW match. Van Dam debuted in a dark match beating Johnny the Bull. Van Dam got a nice reaction and the crowd was also into this match. He had 3 interpromotional matches, with Show and Gunn over Stasiak and Canyon, Kidman over K Quick to keep his belt. Good match. Kidman made Quick look perhaps the best he's ever looked. Saturn beat Crash and Albert over Credible to keep his belt. The Open saw Vince talk about what was going on when Shane, Stephanie and Heyman came out with the ECW crew. Heyman blamed Vince for stealing his concepts, his talent and his television station and putting him out of business. This is where he said in response, he's stealing Vince's children. Also, in response to a different angle just to make sense, Heyman revealed he was the mole. Stephanie and Shane said they can't wait for Vince to die. Heyman said he felt Shane the info to buy WCW from underneath him. Regal talked with Tajiri. They teased the idea that Tajiri hasn't decided whether to stay or go. Austin and Vince did the comedy routine throughout the show of Austin trying to cheer Vince up. Taz beat Bob Holly and then chokes out Tajiri, who was at the announcer's table. Austin was singing to entertain Vince, who wasn't entertained. Jericho beat Storm with the walls. Good match except for one blown spot, which with the magic of post-production, may have never taken place. Made little sense for Patrick to ref with this finish. Austin is singing when Angle showed up. Angle started singing and Vince got so mad he left. Austin got mad at Angle for making Vince leave. Edge and Christian were mad at Awesome because they're the only ones who are awesome. Vince held a meeting with his A-team saying they have to function as a unit. Austin and Angle were still doing comedy. Vince did an interview in the ring telling Austin that he wants the old Austin back. He dared Austin to punch him and give him a stunner because he wanted that Austin leading the team. Austin just walked to the back with his head down. Rhino pinned Kane due to a fast count by ref Nick Patrick. Lita pinned Stratus with a moonsault. Wilson and Keebler kissed the Hardys while Lita and Stratus were in the ring. They saw it on the screen for the start of their angle. All the refs started fighting. Jeff Hardy beat Awesome to win the Hardcore title when Edge and Christian stopped the Awesome Bomb and did the concerto to give Jeff the title. Angle and Undertaker and Shane and DDP. At one point Angle had the ankle lock on DDP, but Undertaker broke it up because he wanted to be the one beating DDP. Raven, Credible, Kenyon and Stasiak ran in, all to be thrown around by Undertaker. A second group runs in, beating up Angle. Undertaker does a great running dive over the top on everyone and starts pounding on everyone, with Angle making a comeback and laying everyone out. But numbers are too heavy and they're beaten down until Kane and Jericho came out. But even more ECW and WCW guys attacked them, finishing with Storm superkicking Jericho, Rhino goring Kane, 3D on Angle, Page cutting Taker, and the show ended with Stephanie, Shane and Heyman out to ECW music. Rock is scheduled to work a full schedule of house shows once he comes back. Ad Age magazine did an item talking about the vindictiveness of Vince by saying that he had planned to blow up a Honda, an original XFL sponsor who pulled out and publicly bashed the league for not delivering the product they were led to believe they would deliver. They were promised they would be sponsoring a football product during a halftime show in one of the final weeks of the season. It said that cooler heads talked him out of it. Spike Dudley suffered a hairline fracture of the fibula when he landed wrong, with his lower leg underneath him while doing the block Dudley Dog in the SmackDown match against the Dudleys, right before he took the 3DA the finish. He'll be out for about 1 month from wrestling, although he will be going on the road and didn't even miss the weekend shows and was involved in an angle. He's right now in a soft cast and walking with one crutch. He actually offered to tape up his ankle and wrestle if needed at the weekend shows. No word yet on Austin's return to in-ring action. Probably not until the pay-per-view. He has deep contusions in his back and he's hurting just putting on his shoes. The little bit of physical stuff he has done has caused his back to spasm. The off-the-record interview with Foley on July 1st on CTV in Canada continued the string of Michael Landsberg interviews with wrestlers that blow away any mainstream reporter in North America when it comes to treating wrestling with respect but at the same time asking real serious questions. Landsberg asked Foley about wrestling's future and will there be more injuries due to inexperienced guys missing cues and because the days of great technical matches being over and not appealing to the current fans. Foley said he felt his I Quit match with Rock was the clear signal that heavy violence wasn't the way to go and thinks there is more of a trend today toward technical wrestling. Citing the success of Benoit and Angle, I wish he was correct and there is something to the fact management in WWF probably wishes it is correct as well due to the injury rate but it just isn't the case. Landsberg asked Foley if he thought he raised the bar when it came to taking risks. Foley agreed that he did, but only for certain people. He said there is no correlation between taking risks and being a success in wrestling. My feeling is in times with certain people there is, not definitely no 100% correlation. Landsberg said people like Rock, Austin and Triple H don't have to take risks because they work the mics so well but the Hardys do have to get over. Foley disagreed, saying the people who make it to the tough all work hard. He said that someone like Ultimate Warrior wouldn't be a headliner today because the business has evolved. Foley said he has personally been told to scale back rather than encouraged to take greater risks. Landsberg said Rock was the most valuable wrestler in the business and Foley agreed. Landsberg said WWF is struggling because Vince can't use the heavy shock because he's running a public company. Foley thinks the image of WWF as being raunchy was more image than reality. Maybe today that's the case, but it wasn't in 1999. Foley felt the appeal of the WWF was the nonsense and foolishness. Landsberg said WWF reclaimed the lead from WWF by highlighting breasts, the appeal of DX and Suck It. Foley disagreed, saying they turned it around through superior storylines. Landsberg quickly asked what storylines were those and Foley said that crediting the WWF turnaround to DX isn't correct, saying X-Pac, Billy Gunn and Road Dogg were never a big part of the shows. Landsberg brought up Sable's breasts and Foley said the less said about that, the better. Foley credited the turnaround to the Austin vs. Vince feud and the Austin character hitting so big. Both agreed wrestling is flat right now. Foley said it was because Vince devoted so much energy to the XFL and because somebody got it into their heads that the TV shows needed to be serious. He said the writers are divided into two political parties, those who are comics and those who want it realistic, and they keep fighting for their respective beliefs rather than working a combination. He thinks people stopped watching because the shows stopped being fun to watch, and because nobody bought the Rock suspension angle. Foley said he asked Vince if he was working during the Costas interview and Vince told him that he wasn't. Foley said he has no urge to make a comeback, but he probably will because to be a major part of the show, at some point he has to do an in-ring confrontation. Landsberg said that if pro wrestling had a union that Foley, for his own good, wouldn't be allowed back in the ring to compete. Foley said if he comes back, it's his choice and unlike Eric Lindros, he can tell his opponents to take it easy on him. He said for the last 15 months of his career he told wrestlers to take it easy on his head because his wife didn't like him taking headshots. If you want to know in a nutshell why the WCW thing was such a flop, this website story on the brief history of the feud says it with amazing clarity. For over 50 years, the World Wrestling Federation has been the dominant force in sports entertainment. Thanks to the vision of Federation Chairman Vince McMahon, the company has become a billion-dollar conglomerate and a worldwide media presence. For a few years in the late 1990s, WCW overtook the Federation in the Monday Night Ratings war, using former Federation talent to do so. For years, the NWO was a dominant force in the sports entertainment industry, with WCW giving fans the impression that the NWO was a Federation entity. Soon, though, the tide shifted back to the WWF, and the Federation soon dominated to the point where WCW nearly went out of business. But shortly before WrestleMania, Shane McMahon purchased the fledgling company, giving it new hope. One of these days, perhaps when it's too late, the company is going to realize they own WCW and it serves them no purpose to continue to bury their history. It is this specific mentality that they've pushed that resulted in the audience reaction they've received. If this isn't Dusty and the UWF all over again, it's probably only worse. Dusty may have buried UWF in booking, but on the television show or in NWO programs, they never portrayed them as a loser company that they had saved from death. SmackDown on July 5th from Tacoma was an entertaining show, but still didn't focus well on the invasion, and really at the end confused the issue. Dudley's beat Spike and Jericho in 6:37 to keep the tag titles with the 3D on Spike. Good match. It appeared Jericho broke his ankle when the Dudley dog was blocked and his ankle was folded underneath on landing. Looked ugly, but he never complained. A bunch of Austin, Vince and Angle stuff with Deborah as the sidekick. Most of it was hilarious. Not sure how it'll help Austin's diminishing drawing power and merchandise power, but I get the feeling some of the people who are writing the show are writing for their own entertainment and don't see the other 50% of the business anyway. Anyway, Vince was depressed. Austin bought him and himself matching cowboy hats, and then bought Angle this goofy kid's cowboy hat, but Angle didn't realize he was a goof and ran around the whole show wearing it. WWF and WCW refs started fighting with Heckner and Nick Patrick getting into a shoving match. Jackie beat Crash in 3:12 with a Frankensteiner off the top. Sucks to be Crash. Double sucks since Jackie potatoed him and he had a bloody nose early. Crash did a real good job here as this match wasn't bad at all, and men versus women matches are usually terrible. Trish thanked Jeff for saving her. Matt and Lita walked in and couldn't figure out why Jeff was even on speaking terms with that woman of so little self-respect that she'd tease Big Show and not even go to Europe with him. Vince got summoned. Apparently the Raw show on the 23rd will be the one where they divide the assets. I guess that'll be the show where they announce that WWF is being split up with Shane and Linda getting half the wrestlers and getting Raw. They won't even let WCW win it in the ring in a match. Kidman pinned Helms in 4:12 to win the WCW Cruiserweight title. Helms is now Gregory Helms, because there can only be one Shane in WWF. Pretty lame reason if you ask me. Kidman's new finisher is a pedigree using the legs instead of arms. X-Pac was watching since they wanted to do a title versus title with X-Pac versus Kidman on pay-per-view. Both guys worked real hard, but appeared rusty. Match was better than most on WWF TV but still sloppy. Crowd barely gave them a chance live. Magic of post-editing is you didn't hear all the Goldberg chants and that the crowd just wanted them gone. Hudson and Anderson made a big improvement announcing. Anderson wasn't good still. Vince did an interview and basically bragged about being a sexual dynamo. It was quite unsettling. At first Vince was very sad until Regal and Tajiri showed up. Vince hugged Regal and got his confidence back. Angle and Austin were jealous that Regal would get hugged by Vince. I wonder if Nash and Triple H were in that position they'd allow themselves to be doing this angle. Show and Gunn beat Hardys in 5:20 when Gunn used the Cobra Clutch Slam on Matt and Show pinned him. There is a moral to the story. If you are lazy or clumsy or uncharismatic, but you've got a WWF contract, eventually if you do nothing good for long periods of time, they'll put you over the guys who have worked their asses off for their spot. Match was better than expected. Albert pinned Edge in 3:34 to keep the IC belt with the Baldo Bomb. If you read the review of the previous match, it covers this one as well to a degree. Not that Albert is either lazy or clumsy. He's simply huge and somewhat lacking in charisma. Christian seems to have a crush on Edge's core trophy. Patterson has to be writing this stuff. Angle and Austin like Vince more than their wives. Well, Kurt with his attitude couldn't get a girl anyway. And Christian is feeling out a damn trophy. Notice the only one who actually seems like they want sex with the opposite sex is Vince, and we are forced to actually watching him in degrees of tonguing with fitness models because he has final approval of the script. Someone comes up with a scenario to get people to care about Benoit and Jericho and it's nixed 2 weeks later because ratings didn't immediately turn around and because they are short or whatever reason was given. But someone comes up with an excuse for Vince to fondle Tori Wilson, or better yet, do so while Saturn is taking a dump, and their longevity is guaranteed. Scotty pinned Malenko in 4:09 with the Worm. A good match that nobody cared about. Booker pinned Page in 7:06 to keep WCW title. These guys worked real hard. It wasn't evident on TV, but apparently the crowd started filing out as Page did his interview, and continued to leave during the match. Crowd was heckling these guys to death, which didn't come across on TV through the magic of post-production. For all their worrying about spoilers ruining their ratings, they ought to count their blessing that taping the show eliminates a lot of embarrassment. Goldberg chants and boring chants edited out were the order of the day. Still, these two had the best match on the show. Undertaker did a run, well, the business term because he did not move well, in. This allowed T to schoolboy Page. Page ran off to the back with Undertaker behind him. Page had to do that famous moving fast slow run that Bruiser Brody pioneered in the 80s when he would have to chase Abdullah the Butcher all over buildings and never catch him, and that takes talent. In this case, Page had to run, but not run fast to expose that Taker can't run. Luckily Taker has all that goodwill built up that Foley used to talk about. because he exposed himself bad in this chase that he had Nash speed. A whole slew of WCW guys beat up Taker outside. In the ring, Angle, at Austin's bidding, ran in on Booker, but Booker cleaned his clock. Shane tried to stop Page from beating on Taker, but Page turned on Shane and the rest of the heels joined in. They're going to Page versus Shane as a program. And then Booker ran out to save Shane and they beat his ass as well. They're desperate to get Booker over as a face and get people to like Shane again, and breaking them from the WCW pack while still being WCW is the idea, and aligning them with Undertaker. Funny press release of the week. TNN sent out a press release noting their network was the fastest growing network in prime time, comparing the second quarter of this year, April through June, with that of last year. TNN went from an 0.63 rating last year to an 0.96 rating. Nowhere in the story did it mention the most important fact of the ratings rise, which is Raw, which was only mentioned later in the piece in passing along with Star Trek, Baywatch and movies. Actually, if you take Raw out of the mix for the quarter, the network average rating would be in 0.57, so it isn't the network that went up, they actually dropped. Of course, that hasn't stopped the network from claiming that they would have had double-digit growth even without the WWF. Simply, they have one hot 2-hour time slot that carries the entire ratings to the point it makes it appear the network is gaining popularity. Funny also that other cable networks don't realize with declining ratings how valuable pro wrestling programming, correctly done, and what a caveat that it this year can be. There have been so many mistakes made with the WCW thing. People like Palumbo, Jindrak and O'Hare should have spent his summer at OVW, not have been brought in, even now, until Cornette deemed them ready. That was part of the problem with WCW at the end, was rushing these guys on the air when they were still green and pushing them hard due to nothing but their look and perceived potential. Luckily, as things stand now, this version of WWF versus WCW is changing again. They were literally almost copying the blueprint of the roller derby folding and roller games takeover. I use the analogy so often because every week it fits more, and subsequent extinction of that genre. Style clashes. Superstars from one organization being portrayed on TV as secondary stars, leading to their fan base dying. Merging teams so teams fans hated became portrayed as babyfaces in their markets and fans didn't accept them and attendance plummeted. Trying to fit everyone into the same style. Actually, this is the one mistake WWF hasn't done, because roller games tried to merge the different styles, whereas WWF wants WCW to work its style, which alienated both sets of fans. The difference is WWF has the financial wherewithal to withstand doing this wrong and wait until the next star comes out of nowhere or new concept comes around, which starts the cycle back up. Right now they are doing a poor job with a golden opportunity, although with all the injuries, some form of cohesive planning has to be out the window anyway. I expect ratings to solidify, however, for the next 2 months. The average fan has no idea who isn't coming in, and there is likely some curiosity as to when Flair, Goldberg, Sting, or whomever else will show up. Once people realize that isn't happening, that curiosity audience will dwindle off like it did in April. However, at about that time, Rock comes back, and certainly for his first few weeks, ratings should increase, probably a lot the first week or two. At least we'd all better hope so. So they really have until August to make this concept work. By October, when it comes time to tour, we'll know the verdict on this. It'll likely be big either way, a big success, or a big failure. Jim Cornette had an operation for a hernia on July 3rd and has to rest up for a few weeks. Kevin Kelly is being brought into OVW to handle the TV announcing in Cornette's absence. OVW had a local 2-hour primetime special on June 23rd to hype the June 27th big show. Show featured a ton of old clips since they were building to the final event at the Louisville Gardens. Just how hard it is to draw was evident when this show drew less than 3,000 with really some tremendous hype and big name stars behind it, plus whatever lore the final event ever in a building that was nearly 100 years old would have. Reality is that it's probably impossible to sell out a 5,000-seat arena for pro wrestling in this country right now if it isn't pure WWF. That show in Memphis with its history and one-time nostalgia was probably as close as it would come today, unless you had Rock or Austin, as this show had Undertaker, Angle, Jericho, and Foley. If there was any doubt as to whether Jericho could be a main eventer, the clip they kept showing of his match from last year with Triple H, where he won the title for a few minutes on Raw, would answer the question. Boy did they blow it. Cornette dug up his old tape collection with clips of many of the big names brought in like Austin Idol, Jerry Lawler, Fabulous Ones, Bruiser Brody, Mongolian Stomper, Bob Armstrong, and even the first known scaffold match with Jerry Jarrett versus Don Green in 1971. There was a match in the 50s that wasn't called a scaffold match but was the same concept. That was totally forgotten, and when the 71 match took place, the belief was they came up with something new. The show also aired the first television appearance ever of The Rock, as they showed a Christmas 1976 family celebration with Rocky Johnson, his wife and his 4-year-old son called Dewey. Surprised WWF never used that one. Also ended with newspaper clips of some of the biggest names in sports and entertainment appearing in the Louisville Gardens, including the Beatles, Elvis, Stevie Wonder, Ali Muhammad, not the guy who headlined Memphis last year, as well as the old ABA Kentucky Colonels. Double main was Rico Constantino over Bobby Eaton in a match where Eaton came off the top again and wasn't too bad, and Flash over Nick Dinsmore in a match that was really good with interference from Machine. The reason Leviathan has changed his look, growing the hair and to keep his face clean shaven, is because he was told by WWF officials to do so when his dark matches elicited loud Goldberg chants. Time magazine did a cover story for its July 9th issue on America's Best Artists and Entertainers and did a section on Best in Fringe Entertainers, and clearly tongue-in-cheek, or someone who simply doesn't watch the product thinking they've got a cute joke, named Stephanie as America's Best Wrestling Personality. TV Guide did a story on Tough Enough, generally positive. It noted that the show was almost in jeopardy when 3 of the 13 quit early on and they were afraid not enough would last the 9 weeks, but that didn't turn out to be a problem. Funniest thing was listing Taz at 5 to 10. I guess no funnier than Angle listing himself at being 6 to 2 on his website. They also described Snow as a guy who looks as if he might moonlight at the local Hells Angels chapter. I guess sort of, but somehow I've never thought of Snow anywhere near those terms. Did you get a load of WWF when announcing SmackDown going live that they are blaming the ratings drop of SmackDown, which took place as largely one big fall in February, and a second since WrestleMania when all their business has fallen, on internet spoilers. Like they didn't exist when the show was doing 5.0s. If you look at the numbers have dropped quicker for Raw, the live show, than SmackDown, the taped show, over the past year. Entertainment Weekly Online had an article called SmackDown and out saying the show's ratings have taken a beating this summer. They blamed it largely on Rock being gone. Good luck explaining it after he comes back, not that his absence isn't part of the reason, although Austin was a far bigger ratings draw than Rock when he went down with a neck injury, and even with his absence, wrestling revenues in nearly every category still grew. They also blamed some of the ratings on Triple H being out. Ratings were declining fast with him on top every week and nearly bottomed out on a show he was in the main event of. Actually, the decline leveled off after he was gone, and a slight comeback started 5 weeks after his injury. Not that his being gone stopped the decline from getting worse, and Austin's heel turn, clearly that has put a damper on the house show business. Regarding ratings, it probably has hurt there, but so many factors between the end of WCW and departure of Rock and Austin's heel turn all happening at the same time make it tough to pinpoint one of them above the other two as reasons, but you can make a good case that all of the three are the reasons. Jason Bernstein of WWF predicted the ratings to rise in July when WCW stars start appearing and they start the interpromotional feud. Well, they did rise on Raw, and SmackDown was up 0.1 this week. In trying to figure how much blame taping as opposed to live means as it pertains to ratings declines, it's pretty simple to figure out if it's a factor. The live show, comparing the period from June 1st to mid-July of last year with this year, in the unopposed second hour, first hour you have the Nitro factor from last year involved, second hour that is removed from the equation, the drop was 29%. For the tape show, the drop was 18%. Raw right now since June 1st averages a 4.37 rating. SmackDown right now averages a 4.31 realistic rating, percentage of homes that can get the show that are watching. Because UPN is available in more homes, SmackDown averages 3.82 million homes and Raw averages 3.55 million homes. A point that also needs to be factored in is that most network and cable individual programming, due to increased competition from more stations, has dropped about 11% to begin with over the past year. Wrestling's drop is more than the TV average, so it is a real news story. SmackDown has dropped the most in its key demo, teenagers, down 30%. The Raw drop is very serious overall, while the SmackDown drop is only somewhat significant. So much for that original theory. Brian Keck of OVW, and likely soon to be departed from pro wrestling, placed 5th in the U.S. team trials at Greco-Roman at 286 pounds on June 22nd and June 23rd in Cincinnati. Keck, who placed 3rd in the qualifying tournament to make this second tournament, was pinned by Paul Devlin in 3:33 in his first match. He came back in a consolation round and won a 5-2 decision over Russ Davey. This put him in the match to go for 3rd place, where he lost 3-0 to Corey Farkas. Farkas ended up 3rd and Devlin 4th behind Rulon Gardner, who beat qualifying tournament winner Dremiel Byers in 2 straight matches. This is the best finisher an active pro wrestler has ever had in the US team trials. Brock Lesnar attended the trials, but not as a competitor, as he retired from amateur after winning the NCAAs in 2000. Although amateurs like to down the pro game, in Wrestling International News magazine, Lesnar said about pro wrestling, "It is a lot harder than I expected it to be. It is more demanding on my body than all my 19 years of amateur wrestling put together. If you don't know how to land right or do a move in the correct way, you are putting yourself and your opponent's life in danger." He also said he's very disappointed at some of the negative comments he's gotten from amateur wrestling people about signing with the WWF. "I fell victim of the amateur people saying, 'Don't watch professional wrestling because it is fake and not real.' I've been trying to get amateur wrestlers like Shelton Benjamin and myself to make a difference somehow in both and professional and amateur world." Speaking of amateur wrestling, Jay Robinson, who was the college roommate at Oklahoma State of Gerald Briscoe, and the college coach of Brock Lesnar and Shelton Benjamin, was named Coach of the Year. Second time, first time was in 1998, in college wrestling, as he guided University of Minnesota to the national championship. David Cash, Kid Cash from ECW, is under contract to WWF but hasn't been used yet. The National Organization of Women released a 15-page report on primetime television for 2000 to 2001. They rated shows based on gender composition and diversity, violence, sexual exploitation, and social responsibility. The report has already been heavily criticized because so many shows weren't even looked at. They found MTV's Celebrity Deathmatch as the worst show but rated SmackDown and XFL in spots 2 and 3. They also listed SmackDown at the bottom of the list in shows with the most sexual exploitation. Some notes on Week 3 of Tough Enough. An entertaining episode. The guy, Jason, who quit, seemed too normal anyway. There was something that rubs me the wrong way seeing people mark out pathetically for a celebrity, whether it be a wrestler or actor or anyone. You can respect their accomplishments, but some of those people's reactions to Triple H was really scary. I actually thought Top Hill Darrell was the only one who recognized how silly the rest of them were acting. Triple H gave a great speech about life in wrestling, but he came across as so much acting for the camera it wasn't funny, with him doing his badass TV face while delivering the lines. I sensed Taz and Jackie in spots as playing to the camera where I never sense it from Snow and Tori. Triple H gives his all and is a great performer who devotes 24/7 and does old psychology and all, but I couldn't help but wonder if he practiced it on Nash while Nash clowned around pissing on all the people who worked hard before him to make this business and trying to kill off Piper and Flair, or on Michaels, who kept coming up with career-ending injuries whenever it was time to drop a belt. Not that he should be blamed for actions of his friends, just that I wish every headliner has that attitude about the business he was trying to instill, and, well, they don't. Even Jason quitting because you have to be on the road so many days bugged me. Sure, if you want to make it in the WWF you have to give up most of your personal life. But if you really love being a pro wrestler, you can enjoy it, be serious about it, and do it for fun and still live a normal life. You'll probably never make money at it, but that's another issue. Because you probably won't either way, because there are so few jobs in wrestling left that pay in this country. Most people in wrestling are forced to live semi-normal lives while hanging on by a thread to wrestling simply because they'll never get in the WWF anyway. Sometimes I wonder if in picking the cast they tried to pick the people who knew the least about pro wrestling going in. There is another aspect that a lot of people haven't seen on this show. Sure, we've seen them in the gym training, in the mud wrestling, jogging down the street. Believe me, what they are doing is nothing compared to what any high school or college football player has gone through during 2-a-days or wrestling practice at a high-class program. The reason I say that is because of the dropout rate. After a few weeks, only one person left, and it wasn't because he physically couldn't handle it, but because he recognized he rejected the lifestyle. Anyone who has competed in contact sports at any kind of a serious level has been through practices where people probably a lot tougher than this crew drop out. It's a fine line because they are doing a TV show, and I'm not advocating 500 squats until you puke wrestling school like what the power plant would do, because that makes for lousy TV, or the old Hiro Matsuda break your ankle school, or the Japanese women method of training, because that would give a negative impression of WWF to the average person. The power plant formula, and quite frankly as their track record shows, may be a bad way of doing things anyway. I haven't seen Gia Girls, which in a sense is tough enough without the hot tub scenes, but those who have seen both probably could write a lot more about this. For the layperson, they probably think that the training is maybe harder than their fantasy of two people waltzing around wearing funny costumes and practicing interviews, but I think anyone who has done sports at any serious level would look at that. See that Bobby Joe with no heart for the business, who's there only to get exposure so she can pose in Playboy, was able to last until the second day, let alone several weeks, and go it's not all that hard. But it is better TV that way because the repetitiveness and brutality of a high-level wrestling school would make for a boring TV show. They did a segment on WWF wrestling and the Winston-Salem study of high schoolers, the one where the more the students watched wrestling, the higher the incidences of antisocial behavior including date violence, and that wrestling fans who were women had numerous antisocial deals far above non-wrestling fans, on the O'Reilly Factor on Fox News Network. The guests were Dr. Robert Durant, who did the study debating Bob Backlund. As with most things on that network, little was accomplished. Backlund, dressed in his red bow tie and suspenders, came off like a total goof, first trying to defend wrestling, and then having to admit he's not proud of a lot that goes on in wrestling. Durant talks so much like a scientist that even though he's got all the facts to back him up, the layperson can't understand what he's saying. O'Reilly understood it and totally believed the study. Durant actually brought up parents supervising what kids watch, which is the usual WWF answer, and O'Reilly blew that response off as a crock, saying that there are so many single-parent homes, and those are the homes that have disproportionate kids getting into trouble in the first place, that it's impossible for parents to do such a thing. He also said far too many parents simply won't do it or are too lazy. Durant said that the WWF has the responsibility, knowing its impact on its audience and the age group watching, to present better quality programming, and O'Reilly almost laughed off that idea. Wrestling came across badly, as a business with zero morals or social responsibility and uncaring about it as long as it makes its own money. That's also in many cases not the slightest bit unfair portrayal of far too many companies. It was funny as they talked about WWF, they aired footage of Jarrett hitting DDP over the head with a guitar from Nitro as well as clips of Backlund versus Jesse Ventura from MSG in 1982. That was every bit as bad as I remembered it. Goodfather is out with 2 pulled hamstrings. The situation with Morris and Jindrak has been largely blown out of proportion, although there was an altercation. Jindrak was working out in the ring and messed up some spots. Morris, as a veteran would do in this situation, told him what he was doing wrong. Jindrak responded calling him a fat slob who had never done anything in the business. It didn't escalate from there. Reportedly WWF officials that were there got a real bad taste regarding Jindrak's attitude. Jim Ross had a meeting with the WCW crew regarding how some are perceiving their attitude, and right now, with the lone exception of Bagwell, WWF officials seem to be happy with how everyone is adapting after a rough early start. From most accounts, the heat between WWF and WCW got a lot worse after Monday and Tuesday. A lot of resentment on both sides, which is again, exactly like the Mid-South deal in 1987, and for that matter, the Roller Games deal in 1974. A lot of WWF wrestlers are already seeing the angle as a major flop based on early crowd reactions. From WCW side, there are those saying that even WCW was more organized long-term and well planned out than WWF, but the general feeling seems to be that WWF is so much more professional in every aspect than WCW. Those who have been in WWF for a long time say they'd never experienced anything like this atmosphere. The original plans became irrelevant because of crowd reactions. The reports were that things were a lot better as it pertains to morale at the house shows. Keibler had some heat again this weekend from the crew on the road when word got out that she was able to get out of going on the road this weekend. She apparently asked some time back if she would be working the shows and was told no. Then the plans for the bra and panties match on the pay-per-view came up, and they wanted all 4 women on the road to practice working, so she was booked. She had made plans to go to the beach with friends and either refused to break them or was given the weekend off, but as you can imagine, that story didn't play well in the locker room, particularly when some of the guys heard the local radio ads for the show and heard Bagwell and Keibler's name mentioned. Toronto Skydome seems to be the frontrunner for WrestleMania next year. Scheduled house show lineup for July 14th in Albany and July 15th in New Haven remains Undertaker and Kane vs. DDP and Awesome, Booker T vs. Angle. Billed as the first interpromotional title match, Albert vs. Jericho for IC, Dudley's vs. Edge and Christian vs. Hardy's vs. X Factor for WWF Tag, Stratus and Lita vs. Tori Wilson and Keibler, Raven vs. Tajiri, Palumbo and O'Hare vs. Canyon and Stasia for WCW Tag titles, Saturn vs. Gunn, Storm vs. Morris and Kidman vs. Helms for WCW Cruiserweight title. Van Dam is said to be in tremendous condition for his comeback. Dreamer got his contract during the week. At one point last week there was at least some talk of Dreamer debuting in Tacoma. He was already in the Northwest working for ECCW on the Rec Sports video list. WWF was down to 10 of the top 20, including spots number 2 and number 3 with WrestleMania and Divas. ECW had videos at number 16 and number 18. The Invasion pay-per-view on July 22 wasn't sold out 2 weeks ahead. There were about 2,000 tickets left to the Gund Arena at press time, with the numbers 12,533 sold for $724,725. Hudson was already let go. As mentioned last week, he was only in for 4 weeks anyway. He was probably buried after the first night in Tacoma, which was practically a career death sentence. He was much better the second night, and they let him do the one interview on Nitro after telling him he was done. Chyna did her first interview since her days with the WWF ended, which aired on several UPN news stations after SmackDown this past week, on the stations that have that really sad policy of doing a pro wrestling news story every Thursday to attempt to keep the wrestling audience. The real newscasters at those stations must hate it, and on were, they sort of showed their disdain for it. While this story had some news value, some of them have been outright pathetic. Linda McMahon was also interviewed. Nothing much was said other than Chyna saying since they were never going to let her win the World Heavyweight title and since she had too much experience to wrestle the other women, she really said that, read that to mean do a job and put anyone over, that she agreed there really wasn't much left they could do with the character. The only thing slightly negative was saying that people who have contracts coming due are going to realize that one person having a monopoly on the business isn't a good thing for the wrestlers. A lot of the contracted talent formerly with WCW that WWF hadn't brought in was in Atlanta for Raw since May lived in the area. Same protocol problems. They were nervous, didn't say hi, got bad reps for sticking together in a corner. None were used in dark or syndication matches, and instead they used Dusty Rhodes guys in jobber roles along with former WCW wrestler AJ Styles. Kyle McNeely, who jobbed for Haku, is NW a Wildside wrestler Onyx. Snow and Malenko were both practicing announcing backstage in Atlanta. They are looking for 2 new members of the broadcast team, with Heyman and Taz being pulled with a current angle. Malenko is one of those guys known for having one of the great backstage wits that somehow never comes across like somebody really funny on the air, similar to Owen Hart. Stevie Ray was like that, which is why WCW tried to make him an announcer at one point. Dave Penzer was kicked out of the building when he tried to go backstage in Atlanta. Apparently some heat with Austin from many years ago. WWFE reached a deal with Uncommon Media Group Incorporated to add virtual pages to its monthly magazines through usage of CD-ROMs. Starting with the November issue of WWF Magazine, subscribers will receive a CD-ROM each month with their magazine, as well as at least 4 additional ones during the year. Raw on July 2nd at the Tacoma Dome drew a sellout 16,351 fans paying $477,715. SmackDown the next night fell to basically a half house with 8,391 paying $256,182 in the same building. House show on July 7th in North Charleston, South Carolina drew 5,874 paying $174,179. House show on July 8th in Augusta, Georgia drew 4,097 paying $114,139. Raw on July 9th at the Phillips Arena in Atlanta drew 9,891 paying $335,040. That crowd was well under half of what WWF had been drawing for previous Raws in Atlanta when booking the Georgia Dome. For the week starting with July 2nd in Tacoma through July 9th, arena merchandise was $284,759 or $6.38 per head. Although Spoken was the first show with WCW talent, these were the first 2 shows with a decent amount of advertising going in as to that fact, and the results were not encouraging. North Charleston, with the WWF roster so depleted due to injuries, saw a 10-match show consist of 4 WCW matches and 1 interpromotional match. Main event was Undertaker and Kane over Page and Awesome when Page walked out on Awesome, leaving him to get pinned by Undertaker. After their match, all 4 were talking at length afterwards about the ups and downs of it to improve for their future matches. Booker pinned Storm in the second match from the top. Booker got a good reaction, but for the most part the crowd wasn't into the WCW matches or the WCW name and logo. There was disappointment since South Carolina was perceived to be stronger WCW territory, and the reality was that those former WCW fans didn't attend the show. Austin was advertised in the original main of Undertaker and Kane vs. Austin and Angle, but it was announced he wouldn't wrestle and refunds were offered. Angle wasn't announced as appearing or not appearing, and ended up doing a run-in and left Booker laying after he beat Storm. Stratus was also sent on the road to get involved in 4 ways for the tag title with the usual suspects, Dudley's, Edge, and Christian Holly's Hardys, as it came down to Dudley's versus Hardys. Stratus started helping Jeff, but Lita attacked her anyway. While everyone was distracted by the catfight spot, Bubba hit Matt with the belt shot for the pin. The Reader's Pages. Montreal Wrestling History. I really enjoyed your show with Jacques Rougeau. I grew up watching Grand Prix Wrestling and lay as de la Lutte, or All-Star Wrestling, as it was known in English, strut their stuff in the early 1970s. If you think the WWF versus WCW promotional wars were something new, to any Montrealer my age, we saw this whole story played out here 25 to 30 years ago. As a bit of a Montreal pro wrestling historian, I see some striking and disturbing similarities between the Montreal Wars back then and what is happening now with this impending WCW invasion. While Jacques was correct in pointing out that the Vachon brothers, Grand Prix, and Johnny Rougeau, All-Star, eventually came to the realization that some pooling of resources would be a good thing, this was only brought about because both groups realized, and as it turned out too late, that they couldn't turn around their respective promotions on their own. Rougeau's All-Star Wrestling, the company name was Eastern Sports Enterprises, was created in 1965, following the death of longtime promoter Eddie Quinn. Built around the Rougeau family name, Johnny and Jacques Sr., they also utilized an interesting mix of local names, some big stars from the United States, and even some imports from Europe. Johnny Rougeau proved adept at creating new superstars. Both Ivan Koloff and Abdullah the Butcher were first created and made headliners by Rougeau here in Montreal. The promotion enjoyed a few great peak periods, largely between 1968 and 1972, culminating in a big baseball park show on July 17, 1972, headlined by the Sheik vs. Jacques Sr., which drew over 26,000 fans. The Vacans, along with a revolving group of investors, which initially included Vern Gagne, opened up in 1971 and tried to establish a different identity, relying more on established superstars like Killer Kowalski and Don Leo Jonathan. While All-Star booked an NWA-style promotion, with more straightforward wrestling, Grand Prix opted for a WWF-style character and gimmick-laden company. What also helped their cause was a successful talent rate of All-Star's top stars, including the Leduc brothers, Dino Bravo, Gino Brito, and most notably Edward Carpentier. Grand Prix grew steadily, especially among the English-speaking community, where its 3 p.m. Saturday afternoon TV show was one of the highest-rated TV shows in all of Quebec. It was soon syndicated throughout eastern Canada and even in upstate New York and Vermont. Grand Prix peaked in 1972-73, and 1 year later, topped Rougeau by drawing more than 29,000 fans to Jerry Park in July 1973 for the match where Mad Dog Vachon won the Grand Prix World Heavyweight title from Kowalski. However, if wrestling history has taught us anything, it's that when something burns white hot, there's only one way to go: down. And it usually happens very quickly. By the end of 1973, after hitting their zenith at the Jerry Park show, Grand Prix began to cool down. It happened almost overnight. Following the blow-off between Vachon and Kowalski, there were no other good feuds prepared. All of a sudden, Grand Prix wasn't the hot TV show in town anymore. All-Star was already hurting from the success of Grand Prix over the previous 2 years. Both promotions were running almost monthly house shows at the Montreal Forum since 1972, and doing great business. All of a sudden both companies were losing money rapidly. So the two sides decided to give the inter-promotional angle a try. The first All-Star/Grand Prix combined show was held at the Forum on February 12, 1974, headlined by a World Champion vs. World Champion match between Jacques Sr. and Jonathan. While the card did great, drawing a sellout of over 18,000 fans, there was, after that match, almost nowhere left to go. Attendance continued to slide for both companies. Both folded in 1975. It would take 6 long years for Montreal wrestling to recover from the fallout of the Grand Prix vs. All-Star War. I'm not saying the same thing will befall the WWF in 2002. They're more than healthy enough to financially survive and wait out an impending down cycle. But the circumstances of Montreal in 1974 and WWF-WCW today are distressingly similar and do not bode well for this pivotal invasion project's success. I also enjoyed hearing you and Jacques talk about the famous Rougeaus vs. Garvins feud in the mid-80s. I was at the Forum for all of their matches and can confirm firsthand that I have never, in 25 years of attending wrestling, seen white-hot heat like I did for that series. The first match, where Jacques Sr. was laid out, stands out with me because the crowd was so shocked and enraged that I was sure they were going to riot. The Garvins also showed some true skill at timing. After their vicious attack left the Rougeaus laying for 5 to 7 minutes, the Garvins, who had already left for the dressing room, shocked everyone by darting back and attacking them again. It was great and really drove the crowd over the edge. Ever since I read your roller derby analogy many moons ago, It's given me a queasy feeling about where the WWF has been headed since WrestleMania. We had roller derby up here in Montreal, and after doing a little research, I discovered, much to my amazement, that the rise and fall of roller derby at the Montreal Forum paralleled, almost to the exact dates, mind you, the rise and fall of Grand Prix wrestling. I think I understand the reasons the WWF is pushing ahead with this pseudo-WCW invasion. Declining ratings notwithstanding, I'm assuming the logic is to keep the WCW brand, and some of its stars, in play, in order to avoid the out-of-sight, out-of-mind pitfall that could have occurred due to such a long downtime. As we know, this is a fickle industry, even more so these days. That in itself makes some sense. I also thought that Page as the Stalker was really the best scenario they could come up with, given the talent available. His speech on Raw was pretty decent, although its impact was somewhat stunted due to it being way too long. Having said that, I think Bill Behrens hit the nail on the head when he surmised the only way for this project to succeed in the long run would be to establish the WCW brand as a separate entity with its own distinct identity. If this project comes off as WWF Light, this whole thing is going down the toilet. And if they push forward into a continued interpromotional feud, that is the only conceivable way the new WCW will be perceived, because you know there is no way, if they work within the same wrestling formula, that Vince McMahon is going to allow any other wrestling brand to overshadow the WWF. The Behrens show on Eyada was excellent and immensely informative. But it was sad at the same time. Anybody who thinks a WWF decline will lead to a revival of the territory system needs to put those thoughts to rest once and for all. The old days are dead. They're not coming back, except on videotape. Jacques Rougeau may be the most successful independent promoter in North America, but even he can't get a whiff of regular local TV, despite all of his sponsorships, connections, and good public sentiment. We know how successful international wrestling was here. It started in 1980. They did great crowds at the Forum almost monthly after 1983. They packed the 5,000-seat Paul Soif Center every Monday night, ran Quebec City, all over Quebec, Northern Ontario, some Maritime Province shows, and even Vermont. But in the 7.5 months from the time Dino Bravo and the Rougeaus left for the WWF in 1986 until the folding of the company 1 year later, Brito lost everything the company had made in its first 6 years. It was costing Brito $8,000 a week for TV and just to keep the company alive. This was 15 years ago. It's quite clear that anyone, even those with booking prowess that is going to get anything started, even at the local level, must come to the table with a sizable bankroll if they hope to make a splash in the game. That rules out everybody, including Jacques Rougeau. I think it's great that he's drawing some good houses in the few shows that he runs. He certainly knows the business. Perhaps more importantly, he understands the distinct nuances of the Quebec market. But aside from running shows every 3 or 4 months, where else does he really have to go? Unless he plans on jogging in place from now until Doomsday, and he certainly can't believe Doomsday won't come. I don't hold out much hope for him long term. I'm not suggesting fans start screaming in a blind panic, but it also scares me to see people nonchalant about this, thinking pro wrestling is for some reason indestructible. Sure, roller derby didn't have the lengthy history that pro wrestling has had during the 20th century, but it had been around, been a staple of television, and was firmly established for decades when the early 70s boom period happened. It had strong television syndication, a high profile, and drew huge crowds. Yet when it died very shortly thereafter, boy did it die. And despite numerous revival attempts, there is absolutely nothing to suggest that it will ever catch on again. Look at how pro wrestling is being perceived nowadays by advertisers and TV executives, and I'm truly concerned. It's bad enough that the economic realities of today exclude about 99% of us from ever hoping to start up, but what does it tell you when the WWF, the richest company in the history of the industry with incredible resources and a sweetheart deal with a telecommunications giant like Viacom, can't even clear a graveyard time slot on TNN for an established brand with the history of WCW? A show that was delivering ratings numbers that a channel like TNN would kill for, even during its worst days. Throughout the WWF versus WCW war, I always cheered for the WWF, even in 1996-97. I did so mainly because I knew it was Eric Bischoff's intent to put the WWF out of business. In hindsight, if you look back at the money they spent to get Bret Hart, a wrestler Bischoff had no plans for, except that he thought his signing would be the final nail in the WWF's coffin, it's fairly clear what his intent was. I felt then, as I do know, that McMahon would always keep the industry alive because he was born into it, understood it, and was savvy enough business-wise to be able to renew it when needed. Had the situation been reversed and it been the WWF that died in 1998, I believe Bischoff's hot-shotting crash and burn mentality would have ultimately destroyed pro wrestling as a national entity and on a big scale. The kind of product WCW foisted upon us in the post-NWO era pretty much confirmed those suspicions. Wrestling still may wind up in a comparably tenuous state if the WCW project turns into XFL Part 2. Competition is what created the late 90s boom, and if the new WCW fails, there won't be even pseudo-competition. That only will breed stagnation, and stagnation equals death in the entertainment world. There are simply too many other options for our free time for fans to think wrestling will always be there just because. Although I'm nervous about it, I hope this WCW relaunch provides one of the sparks needed to at least level off the factors of this down cycle, if not revive things a little bit. As it stands now, the WWF, while they've made some minor mistakes with it, haven't wrecked the project, yet. The next couple of months should tell the tale. Darren Gleason. Tough Enough. I work on the independent scene to an extent, and was disgusted after viewing Tough Enough. I think it was the day before when WWF killed up 2 developmental territories, which in turn, killed off many developmental contracts. Think about 2 extremely talented workers like Christian York and Joey Matthews being laid off after busting their asses for years for nearly no money every night. Those 2 spots will be filled by 2 lucky greenhorns that wouldn't know a thing about paying their dues even if every single worker who has never gotten a WWF contract called them up and told them how much of a struggle it is. Making the 250, the 25 and the 13. What did you need to pass those barriers? A good body. A little charisma and a sense of desire. After this, what now? All you have to do is beat out 11 other greenhorns and keep your mouth shut for 9 weeks and you've got a contract. There isn't anything they could do on that show that will make me think they can possibly make these prima donnas appreciate the opportunity they have been given. They could eat feces 24 hours a day for 9 weeks and it still doesn't capture the stench of this business when you get to the core of it. I personally know dozens of guys who have worked 50 times harder for 50 times longer than these greenhorns, and will never get the shot that these people are getting. Does their 10 years of sacrifice not matter? WWF is taking a massive crap on the rest of this business with this poor excuse for reality TV. Reality? My reality is training 3 times a week in the gym, watching tapes for 30 hours a week to study, working out with weights 4 times a week and doing 4 to 5 indie shots a month for Jack, only to know that I probably will never have a WWF contract and never get on WWF TV. Think about guys with talent like York and Matthews and try to tell yourself that the hell Taz puts these people through can even compare. For 9 weeks, they live in a nice house, train with wrestlers most indie guys will never even meet. I've been through all the hell they're going to experience and more. I'm not saying I deserve a WWF contract, but do they? I always tell people how messed up this business is, but they never understand because they have nothing to go on. They just see the glitz and glamour and the story of Mick Foley being some fat regular guy who turned out to be a big success. This is the most blatant example of how depressing this is. Name withheld by request. WCW relaunch. I said it before. The purchase of WCW will turn out like every other pro wrestling buyout. It will bury the buy. There are no overstars. Booker T is a good enough wrestler and has enough personality that he can shine if he's pushed hard, but he can't make it walking in as an unknown champion who hasn't proved himself to the audience. Don't kid yourself, half the audience has no idea who he is. They see him as a guy who gave Austin a cheap shot and ran away. And we thought Austin was the heel. DDP comes in as super heel, then gets almost no offense and is even beaten up by Undertaker's wife. Lance Storm superkicked the air. Mike Awesome won the hardcore title. WCW invaded. Here's the score. A bunch of nobodies are getting beaten up and somebody thinks that's going to sell tickets. I'm afraid that after the pay-per-view even Bill Goldberg won't be able to save the brand name. Dave Katz. The business really took a bump. I've been expecting this. The recovery is going to be tough. In my 39 years of following this, I've seen my share of cycles. It takes wrestling to get it back. Dick Destroyer Bear. Bagwell. Watching Raw last week brought back a memory. I was the guy who had to work with Marcus Bagwell in his tryout match with WCW back around 1991 or 1992. As a result of that match, he got his job with WCW after watching him in that match with Booker T on Raw. I wish I wasn't such a great worker. Never thought I was, but I must have been to make Bagwell look good enough to get a job in the first place. I would like to say I'm sorry to the fans for helping him get his job. But it's not my fault he sucks so bad that this match will go down in history as the most disastrous match in the Raw history. Let's hope they never try and top it, or Raw itself could be history. Bob Cook. Pride. I really can't understand the fact that so-called MMA fans simply can't, or refuse, to see the obvious. These days we get huge shows filled with the best fighters in the world earning more money than they've ever had the opportunity to earn in the past. For the most part, they're taken care of very well. Surely it's not so bad to have to suffer watching two pro wrestlers fighting each other if they are the guys actually drawing the money that pays the other fighters. Is that really so hard to accept or understand? It reminds me of the kind of wrestling fans you see all over the internet who are outraged that a guy like Yoshihiro Tajiri would sign with the WWF and earn a nice living doing very little when he should be working in Japan, destroying his body on the indie scene, for very little money. People need to wake up to the real world. Business is business. In the end, if you can't draw money, the promotion goes out of business. It couldn't be more simple. Sure, you might prefer to watch a camcorder tape of two guys beating each other up on a beach in Brazil, but I'm pretty sure the fighters themselves would take a Pride booking over that any day, even if it means working on the same show as those evil pro wrestlers. Pride is very big in Japan, but it's only big because of the stars. Kazushi Sakuraba was on TV on almost a daily basis earlier this year, but other than he and Rickson Gracie, there are so few real fighters who the average person in Japan actually cares about. If I asked my friends here in Japan or my girlfriend's family what they thought about Vitor Belfort or Heath Herring match, they wouldn't have a clue who they were. But everyone knows who Kazuyuki Fujita is, just like everyone knows who Naoya Ogawa and Shinya Hashimoto are. You don't have to be a pro wrestling fan to know them. They're all over the media here. Last month Hashimoto was actually modeling clothes in a magazine I saw, which was even scarier than it sounds. If MMA can exploit the popularity and mainstream exposure that pro wrestling receives in Japan, then surely it's a good thing for the sport. Chris Hodgson. Wrestling Observer Live. I think I just broke my best friend's heart when I called him to tell him Wrestling Observer Live was ending. He had been away in Greece for the past month and a half and was really looking forward to hearing the show again. I just wanted to let you know how much I enjoyed the show over the past almost 2 years. During a time when pro wrestling had its ups and downs, Wrestling Observer Live was always entertaining and a reminder of why I liked pro wrestling. Until you find your way back on the air, I'll have to make myself content with my saved archives of my favorite show. I probably wasn't supposed to do that, but I'm really glad I did. I'd like to thank you, Ryan, Al, Jeff Marek, Bruno Sammartino, Ric Flair, Bret Hart, Bobby Heenan, Bad News Allen, Jim Cornette, Ted DiBiase, Leigh Thatcher, Julian Shabazz, Brian Blair, Tom Zank, Raven, Missy Hyatt, Jacques Rougeau, Jim Neidhart, Steve Regal, Eddie Guerrero, Kurt Angle, Frank Shamrock, and your dogs for all the wonderful memories. Jared K. Ray Stevens. Your show on Ray Stevens was tremendous. Although I only saw him wrestle once or twice, it was nice to hear from the guys and hear all the old stories. Hopefully you can do it again sometime. The interplay between Bobby Heenan and Brian Alvarez was hilarious. Too bad we don't have more of Heenan when he's on a regular basis. He's so gifted. Kudos to Alvarez for matching wits with someone equally as funny. You've been mentioning how Keiji Muto has been having quality, although limited matches in Japan. It got me to thinking of some of my first memories of him as Great Muta. It also reminded me of the after-pushed wrestlers of that era like Lex Luger, Sting and Ultimate Warrior, who are in the same age group he's in. He's the only one left and the only one who can still do a match, yet he's in the worst physical shape with his bad knees and neck. But he's still in Japan headlining or two major companies and still drawing big houses. I was thinking back to WCW when Muta returned and got that surprisingly tremendous crowd response when he first appeared. Then Vince Russo destroyed him. I think fan respect is a strong plus to older, broken-down wrestlers, and can carry them strong. The fans respect Steve Austin for his accomplishments and for his ability to overcome the odds. But when he's in an unflattering role, like he is now, the fans won't accept it. Like Ric Flair, Austin is in a place where it is not his performance that is lacking, but it's just a poor role. The longer they stick with this stuff from Austin, the further he'll sink. I'm sure he's good enough to elevate himself from under this gimmick he's in, but we are suffering in the meantime. Troy Atone. Response from Dave Meltzer. In Japan, legendary status is a lot bigger deal than in the US. Muta, in the shape he was in, just wasn't going to cut it here. Maybe he could have been used differently, and no doubt his standing in wrestling should have been respected more, but ultimately it wasn't going to work in a major way because of his knees. You can blame Russo for not caring about the New Japan relationship by burying one of their biggest stars, but from his perspective, under his system, it couldn't work. Even under somebody else's system, it would have been very limited what you could have done with him. TV ratings. Given another week of disappointing ratings, the WWF should look at how they are promoting their TV product. Currently, the WWF relies on brand loyalty to get people to tune in. Matches like Benoit versus Angle in a cage aren't even advertised beforehand. To a degree, that's smart, because the WWF doesn't want to be reliant on one or two hot performers, but that approach doesn't seem to be working right now. Looking at last night's main event, it seems likely that a Raw fan would be interested in seeing the match, but they wouldn't even know it's on unless they were already watching the show. Years ago, the WWF studio shows like Primetime Wrestling were produced like entertainment shows. They showed brief clips of upcoming action prior to a commercial break to keep viewers tuned to the show. The WWF should experiment with this during SmackDown. The WWF should also produce a theatrical-style trailer for each episode of SmackDown and use it to advertise the show. In recent years, the WWF has presented its product like sport. Even taped shows like SmackDown are presented as if they are occurring live. Perhaps the WWF would be better served by presenting its product as entertainment. With Bischoff and WCW nothing but a bad memory, the time has come to ask whether airing Raw live has any advantages over taping it in advance to the show can be promoted beforehand. Frank Jewett. After sitting back and listening to numerous theories regarding the decline in TV viewership, I'd like to give my thoughts. Nobody has hit upon the WWF's true base problem. In pro wrestling, when you have a strong feud, after it goes on long enough, one man has to win. And then the feud is over. I believe the WWF's root problem is that after one hell of a feud that featured many twists and turns and captured the attention of millions, the WWF beat WCW. It ended clean in the middle. The story is over. It's the end of the feud. It's also the end of a large portion of the casual audience's motivation to follow wrestling. Sure, lack of attention to elevating certain wrestles, some at times illogical booking and other factors have contributed to this rapid decline, but I think the real reason, which nobody has stated, is that the war is over. For a sizable portion of the inflated audience the business has enjoyed over the past